Gideon Rusk pressed his thumb across the bottom of the payroll ledger, smearing the ink before it dried. He did it slowly, deliberately, the way a man does something he has done so many times it no longer troubles him. Then he looked up at the row of men standing outside the office window, dusty, hat in hand, waiting for wages they had already earned 3 times over, and he smiled. "Short month," he said, sliding envelopes across the desk that held barely half of what was owed. Ranch had expenses. Not one of them argued. They had stopped arguing months ago. What Gideon did not know, what no one at Silver Creek Ranch knew yet, was that a woman with a battered suitcase and a notebook full of numbers had just stepped off the stage road. And she had seen men like him before. She had watched one of them take everything her family owned. She was not going to let it happen again. If you've ever watched someone steal from people who trusted them and felt completely powerless to stop it, this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel and follow Mara's journey all the way to the end, because what she uncovers at Silver Creek Ranch will shake you. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. The stage driver set her bag down in the dirt without ceremony, flicked the reins, and left before she had even gotten her bearings. Mara Whitlock stood at the edge of the road and looked at Silver Creek Ranch the way she looked at everything new, carefully, without rushing to a conclusion. The property was large. That was the first thing. Rolling pasture land stretching north toward a dark line of timber, a cluster of outbuildings arranged around a central barn, a main house set back from everything else with a covered porch running the full length of the front wall. Cattle dotted the far pasture. There were horses in a paddock near the barn, and several men moving through the yard, though none of them moved with any particular urgency. Mara noticed the urgency missing before she noticed anything else. She had worked on 4 different ranches and 2 commercial freight operations in her years as a bookkeeper. She knew what a well-run outfit looked like from 200 yards. The men at Silver Creek were not lazy, she could see that, but they moved like people who had learned not to attract attention. Eyes down. Quiet conversations that stopped when anyone came near. That particular stillness that settles over a place where someone is always watching, and the watching is never kind. She picked up her suitcase and walked through the gate. The man who came out to meet her was not who she had expected. The letter from Silver Creek Ranch had been signed by Colter Hayes, which she had assumed was the owner. But the man who walked down the porch steps toward her wore a suit that cost more than her monthly wage, and carried himself like someone who expected the world to accommodate his schedule. "Miss Whitlock." He extended his hand. "Gideon Rusk. I manage operations for the ranch. Mr. Hayes is indisposed at present. I'll be handling your orientation." His handshake was firm in the way of men who practice it. His smile arrived exactly 1/2 second after his words, like something he put on after deciding it was necessary. "Of course," Mara said. "Thank you for meeting me." She did not say she was pleased to meet him. She filed him under the category she reserved for men who said, "I manage operations," when what they meant was, "I am in charge," and followed him inside. The office was at the rear of the main house, a spacious room with 2 windows, a heavy oak desk, and shelving along the east wall stacked with ledgers and document boxes. Mara took in the organization of it in a single sweep and already felt the familiar unease settling in her stomach. The shelving was neat. Too neat. Bookkeepers who actually used their records let them show the evidence of use dog-eared pages, stacked invoices waiting to be entered, a ledger left open to the current month. This shelving looked like the set dressing in a room no one actually worked in. "The accounts have gotten a bit behind," Gideon said, managing to sound both apologetic and dismissive at the same time. The previous bookkeeper was not particularly detail-oriented. "We brought you in to clean things up. Straightforward work." "What happened to the previous bookkeeper?" Mara asked. A small pause, not long, barely a beat. "She left to care for a family member," Gideon said. Quite sudden, Mara nodded as though this satisfied her. It did not satisfy her at all. He showed her to the room she would be staying in, comfortable, clean, a window that faced the east yard, and left her with a stack of ledgers, and the instruction to familiarize herself with the general picture before their meeting the following morning. Mara thanked him, waited until his footsteps faded down the hall, and then sat on the edge of the bed with the top ledger open in her lap. She turned to the most recent entries and began to read. By the time the light through the window had shifted from gold to orange, she had a knot in her chest that she recognized. She had felt it once before, sitting at a kitchen table in Missouri, watching her father's hands shake as he tried to explain why the deed to their farm had his signature on it, but was no longer in his name. The numbers in the Silver Creek ledger were wrong, not by accident, not by the carelessness of a distracted bookkeeper running behind on entries. The wrongness had a pattern, the particular signature of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She was in the kitchen before dawn, the next morning, which was a habit from childhood, and also, over the years, a useful professional strategy. The cook, a wide-shouldered woman named Fran, who moved through her domain with the authority of a general, regarded Mara with mild suspicion and then set a cup of coffee in front of her without comment. Mara took it as the offering it was. "Been here long?" Mara asked. 12 years, Fran said, cracking eggs into a cast iron pan with practiced efficiency. "Like it here?" Fran's hand slowed for just a moment. "It's work," she said, which was Mara understood its own kind of answer. She finished her coffee and went back to the office before the household stirred. She had brought her own notebook, a narrow cloth-bound thing she had carried for 3 years, and replaced the pages in twice. She opened it to a fresh section, dated the top of the page, and began to write down every discrepancy she had identified the night before. Supply costs inflated. Payroll entries that did not match the worker headcount. 3 line items entered as equipment maintenance in the same 2-week span, each for identical amounts, which was the kind of coincidence that was not a coincidence. And something else. Something she had noticed almost at the end, in the back of the second ledger where the property records were kept. A notation she had to read 3 times before she was sure she was reading it correctly. A land transfer. 240 acres, the north section pasture, the most valuable grazing land on the property, transferred 11 months ago to an entity called Crestfield Grazing Partners. Mara had never heard of Crestfield Grazing Partners. She wrote the name in her notebook and circled it twice. She was still writing when she heard the boots on the back porch, a slow, unhurried step. Not the purposeful stride of a man headed somewhere specific, but the measured walk of someone familiar enough with a space to move through it without thinking. The door opened, and a man she had not seen the day before came into the kitchen, stopped when he saw her, and said nothing for a moment. He was tall in the way that some men are tall, without seeming to use it, not filling the doorway, just occupying it. Worn work clothes, no hat indoors, dark hair that needed cutting. Hands that had done real labor. He looked at her notebook, then at her, then at the ledger on the desk beside her. "You the new bookkeeper?" he asked. "Mara Whitlock," she said. He nodded once. "Colter. Just the one name." He said it like it was all she would need, poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove, and sat down at the kitchen table without asking anyone's permission. Mara watched him and filed him away differently than she had filed Gideon Rusk. This one she needed to understand before she decided what category he belonged to. "You work here long?" she asked. "Long enough," he said. "You like it?" He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "Long enough," he said again, but this time with a slight shift at the corner of his mouth that might have been something. He finished his coffee, rinsed the cup at the basin, and went out the back door without another word. Marta listened to his footsteps across the porch and down the steps, and then she turned back to her notebook. She circled Crestfield Grazing Partners again. The meeting with Gideon that morning was everything she'd expected. He sat across from her with his suit pressed and his manner expansive and explained, in the smooth, practiced tones of a man accustomed to being believed, that the accounts were in a transitional period following some necessary restructuring of ranch expenses. He used the word restructuring 4 times. He explained that the payroll irregularities were the result of a modified wage schedule he had implemented to stabilize cash flow during a difficult quarter. He explained that some of the property notations might look unusual to an outside eye, but were perfectly regular arrangements that the owner was fully aware of. Mara asked one question through all of it at the very end. "Is there a written record of the owner's authorization for the wage schedule modification?" Gideon's smile held. "I'd have to locate the relevant correspondence." "I'd appreciate that," Mara said pleasantly. "For the records." She left the meeting and went directly to the stable, not because she had business there, but because she had noticed the stable was the one building on the property that Gideon Rusk never seemed to enter. She was not surprised to find Colter there, running a brush down the side of a gray horse with the unhurried patience of a man who was waiting for something. "Tell me about the wage schedule," she said. He kept brushing. "What about it? Rusk says it was modified 6 months ago. The men are getting less than their contracted rates." "Yes," Colter said. "You know that, yes. And you haven't—" She stopped. "Started differently. How much less are they getting?" He looked at her then directly. "Depends on the man. Boone Mercer, the head wrangler, he's getting roughly 60% of his rate. Some of the younger hands are getting less." Mara stood still for a moment. 60%, give or take. And no one has gone to the owner. Colter turned back to the horse. "The owner isn't here." "Where is he?" That, Colter said, with a particular evenness that she was beginning to recognize as its own form of expression, is a complicated question. She found Boone Mercer at the fence line that afternoon, mending a section of post that had been pushed over by cattle. He was in his 50s, weathered face, the kind of man who had spent so long outdoors that he seemed continuous with it, his stillness matching the stillness of the pasture, his silence as natural as the wind. He looked at Mara when she approached and did not seem especially surprised to see her. "You're the bookkeeper," he said. "Yes. Wondered when you'd come out here." She leaned against the fence post next to him and watched the cattle for a moment. "What do you know about Crestfield Grazing Partners?" His hand stopped on the wire. He looked at the cattle a moment longer before he answered. "Know it didn't exist before Russ came here," he said. "Know that the North Pasture transfer happened about 3 months after he arrived. Know that Hayes, the old man, He stopped. Know that Hayes would never have agreed to any of that. Did you see the transfer documents?" "No. But I knew Hayes Sr. 30 years I worked this land. He built this ranch from 40 acres of sorry scrubland to what it is now. He wasn't selling the North Pasture to anyone, and he wasn't signing his land over to a shell company to be parceled off." He picked up the wire again. "Couldn't prove it, but I knew. When did Hayes Sr. pass?" 2 years ago, February. Boone worked the wire through the post with practiced efficiency. Month later, Russ shows up with authority papers. 6 months after that, the wage cuts start. 6 months after that, Judy Callahan, that was the bookkeeper before you, she was gone. They said, family emergency. She didn't have any family left. Mara wrote nothing down. She kept it all in her head where no one could find it. Did she know what she'd found? Couldn't say. But she was quiet her last 2 weeks. The kind of quiet a person gets when they've seen something they can't unsee. Mara nodded. She knew that quiet. She was living in it right now. That evening, she laid everything she had on the narrow writing desk in her room. The payroll discrepancies, the land transfer, Crestfield Grazing Partners, 3 identical equipment maintenance payments, the missing authorization documents Gideon had not produced, the previous bookkeeper's departure under circumstances that did not add up. She drew lines between the elements in her notebook, the way her father had taught her to organize figures clustering related items, tracing connections. Her father had been a careful man, a methodical man, a man who believed that if you kept your records properly, they would always tell you the truth. He had been right about that. The trouble was that someone else had been keeping his records too. She was still working when a sound from outside pulled her attention. Not a loud sound, a voice, low in the direction of the main barn. She went to her window, 2 men in the yard below. Gideon and another she didn't know heavier, in a town coat not suited to ranch work, speaking with his hands in a manner that suggested he was used to giving instructions rather than taking them. They talked for perhaps 5 minutes. The stranger handed Gideon an envelope. Gideon handed him a folded sheaf of papers in return. They separated without ceremony. Mara watched the stranger's horse disappear down the access road toward town and stood at her window for a long time afterward. Whatever Gideon was doing, he was not doing it alone. She was in the stable at 5 the next morning, before the hands arrived, looking through the storage room off the back of the building, where she had noticed a stack of old crates the day before. She told herself she was looking for nothing specific. That was not entirely true. What she found was a canvas bag behind the second crate from the left, wedged between the crate and the wall. Inside, 3 ledger books that she had not seen in the office. Older books, 5 years of records predating Gideon's arrival. And tucked inside the back cover of the oldest one, a handwritten letter. She read it twice, very carefully, and then put it back exactly where she had found it and went to saddle one of the horses for a ride she didn't need, because she needed something to do with her hands while she thought through what she had just read. The letter was from the previous bookkeeper, Judy Callahan, written to Hayes, not Hayes Sr., who was already gone by the time she wrote it, written to the heir, telling him what she had found, asking him to come back before it was too late. Mara rode to the north fence line and stared at the pasture Crestfield Grazing Partners now owned on paper, and she turned over the same question again and again. Was there an heir? And if there was, where were they? She had been at Silver Creek 11 days when everything changed. She had been careful in the way she pulled ledgers off the shelf, always replacing them in the same position, angled the same degree. Careful about which hours she worked in the office and which she appeared to spend on ordinary tasks. Careful in her conversations, keeping them short and surface level, asking only the questions that a new bookkeeper would reasonably ask in the course of ordinary work. She was not careful enough about Colter. He found her one evening on the east side of the barn, where she had been sitting with the canvas bag's contents spread out in her lap, cross-referencing dates. She heard his boots stop behind her and went very still. "You found Judy's stash," he said. It was not a question. She closed the ledger she was holding and turned around. In the fading light, she could not read his expression clearly enough to know what to do with it. "I wasn't sure those books existed," she said. "I was hoping they did." "What did you find?" She studied him for a moment. Colter, just Colter, who poured his own coffee and worked alongside the hands and said everything in the fewest words possible and looked at the ranch property as though it caused him something complicated to look at it. "Who are you?" she asked. The silence ran long enough that she almost repeated the question. Then he said, Colter Hayes. She had already known it was coming, and it still hit her somewhere behind the sternum. The heir. Yes, you've been here the whole time. 3 weeks before you, he said. I came back when I heard the hands were getting short wages. I didn't know the extent of it yet. He looked at the ledger in her lap. I think maybe you do. She looked down at the numbers she had spent nearly 2 weeks assembling, and then she looked back up at him. It's worse than you think, she said. How much do you trust me? I'm still here, he said. That's what I've got. She opened the ledger to the page she had marked. Then sit down, she said. This is going to take a while. She walked him through it methodically. Not the way she might explain a simple accounting error, but the full structure of what she had uncovered, the layered entries, the shell company, the land transfer, the wage skimming, the forged authorization documents she was now nearly certain existed. She showed him Judy Callahan's hidden records. She showed him the pattern in the maintenance payments, each one routing through a vendor name she couldn't locate in any directory she had access to. Colter listened with the same stillness he brought to everything. He did not interrupt. He did not react dramatically to any single point. When she finished, he sat for a moment looking at the spread of documents and said, The man who came 3 nights ago. In the town coat you saw him. I've seen him before. In Billings 2 years ago. He was at the bank when we were settling my father's estate. His jaw tightened. His name is Aldous Crane. He's a land broker. Mara wrote the name in her notebook. Does Crane know who you are? If he doesn't, Rusk does, Colter said. Rusk knew my father. Knew me when I was a boy. He looked at the ledger. He let me work here for 3 weeks without acknowledging it. Because acknowledging it would have acknowledged the problem, Mara said. Yes. Which means he knows you suspect him. Colter looked at her levelly. Yes. Which means we don't have as much time as I thought we did. The following morning, Gideon Rusk arrived at Mara's office door with 2 things, a smile and a request. He wanted, he said, to see her progress on the accounts. He understood she was still getting oriented, but he was hoping she might have a preliminary summary prepared. He asked with the particular pleasantness of a man who knows where the exits are. Mara showed him 3 pages of clean, organized, entirely unremarkable figures that she had prepared specifically for this conversation. Nothing that revealed what she actually knew. Numbers that reflected surface-level work, competent and uninteresting. Gideon studied them. His smile didn't change. Excellent, he said. Very thorough. She thanked him. He left. She listened to his footsteps cross the hall, pause near the parlor door, and then continue to his own office. She gave it 15 minutes, and then went to the stable, where Colter was waiting. He checked, she said. He's not satisfied. How long do we have? She thought about it. Days, she said, maybe less. Colter looked at the ceiling of the stable for a moment. The county registry office is in Hargrove, day's ride. I need to get copies of the original land transfer documents, Mara said. If they're registered with forged signatures, there'll be something off in the notarization. And I need to cross-reference Crestfield Grazing Partners against the state business registry. I know a man in Hargrove, Colter said, Thomas Aldred. He was my father's banker for 20 years. He'll help if I ask. Can you trust him? Colter considered it seriously before answering, which she appreciated. Yes, he said finally, but not because he's good. Because he's practical, and helping me is better for him than the alternative. Good enough, Mara said. We leave before dawn. They rode out before 4 in the morning when the ranch was still dark, and the only sound was cattle settling in the far pasture. Mara had her notebook and a leather satchel with the copies she had made, careful copies, ink and paper, every forged entry she had identified. The original she had left exactly in place. Colter rode without talking, which suited her. She used the hours to organize her thoughts, running through what she would say to Thomas Aldred, in what order, with what documentation, anticipating the questions and objections a cautious banker might raise. By the time the light came gray in the east, she had her argument assembled. They made Hargrove by mid-morning. The town was larger than she had expected. 2 proper streets, a bank, a courthouse, a stage office, and the county registry tucked between a dry goods store and a surveyor's office, as if embarrassed to take up too much space. Colter tied the horses outside the bank and held the door for her. Thomas Aldred was a small, precise man in his 60s who wore his reading glasses on a chain around his neck and greeted Colter with the careful neutrality of someone who has learned not to show surprise. He looked at Mara once thoroughly and then pulled the blinds on his office window and asked them to sit. Tell me everything, he said, and leave nothing out. Mara did the talking. She had already decided this was the right approach. Colter's name was on the property and carried weight, but Aldred was a numbers man, and numbers men trusted numbers. She laid out the documentation, walked him through the transfer records, explained the shell company structure, and finally placed Judy Callahan's letter on the desk. Aldred read it twice without speaking. I notarized 2 documents for Rusk in the months after your father died, he said to Colter. He told me they were estate administration papers. I assumed he stopped. I should not have assumed. We need an emergency hold on the property transfers, Mara said. Through the registry. Pending investigation. On what authority? Colter Hayes is the named heir and deed holder to Silver Creek Ranch. The transfers in question bear his father's signature, who was deceased at the time of transfer, or bear an authorization signature that is not consistent with any document I've found in the ranch records. Aldred looked at Colter. You understand what you're starting? Yes, Colter said. Rusk has connections in this county. The land broker he's working with. Aldous Crane, Marissa said. Aldred's expression shifted. Not surprised, something worse recognition. Crane has done 4 similar transactions in this territory in the last 3 years. I suspected the methodology but couldn't prove it. He folded his hands on the desk. If you can prove it at Silver Creek, it opens the others. Then we need to move quickly, Mara said. Before Rusk knows we've been here. Aldred reached for his pen. I'll go to the registry with you myself, he said. My name on the request carries weight they can't easily ignore. They were at the registry office for 2 hours. The clerk, a nervous young man named Ferris, who seemed constitutionally opposed to any decision that might be reversed later, had to be walked through the request 3 times before he agreed to place the provisional hold. Aldred's presence helped. The documentation Mara had prepared helped more. By early afternoon, the hold was registered and signed. Mara let out a breath she had been holding for what felt like most of the day. They were back on the road to Silver Creek by 2 o'clock. Colter rode without speaking for several miles, and then said, You've done this before. Not exactly this, she said, but something like it. He waited. She kept her eyes on the road ahead, my father's farm. I was 21. A man came through selling land consolidation arrangements, told my father it was a way to protect the property from tax seizure. My father signed papers he didn't fully understand, and we lost the farm 18 months later. I found out afterward what had actually happened, what the documents actually said. She paused. I couldn't undo it, but I understood afterward exactly how it had been done. And you became a bookkeeper. I became someone who reads documents very carefully, she said. The bookkeeping followed naturally. They rode in silence for a while. The afternoon was warm, the road dusty, the sky enormous and indifferent in the way of Montana skies. I'm sorry, Colter said, about your family's farm. It was a long time ago, she said. But thank you. They reached Silver Creek as the sun was getting low. The ranch looked the same from the road, which was either a good sign or a bad one. Mara had been watching for it and couldn't decide which. They were halfway across the yard when Fran appeared at the kitchen door and said, in the flat voice of someone delivering a fact rather than an opinion, Rusk was in the office for 2 hours this afternoon. Left about an hour ago. Mara stopped walking. He took some papers with him, Fran added. Don't know which ones. Thought you'd want to know. Colter was already moving toward the office. Mara followed, her satchel still over her shoulder. The office had been searched. Not carelessly, whoever had done it had tried to put things back, but Mara knew where everything had been and could see the differences in the placement. 3 ledgers pulled and replaced at slightly wrong angles. The document box on the second shelf moved a finger's width from its position. The center desk drawer, which she had left unlocked, showed scratches around the lock that hadn't been there this morning. He was looking for something, Colter said. Yes, Marissa said. He was looking for what I know. She went to the shelf and checked the position of a particular ledger, the one she had been working from most visibly, keeping it on top of the stack as a kind of decoy. It had been moved and replaced. He found my working ledger. Does that hurt us? Mara took off her satchel, opened it, and set her notebook on the desk. It would have, she said, if I kept my real notes in the working ledger. Colter looked at the notebook. Everything important is in here, she said, and copies of the key documents are already at the registry office. She sat down. Let him think he's seen what we have. He hasn't. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, the last of the day's light was retreating, and somewhere in the yard, a horse snorted and stamped. He'll move faster now, Colter said. Yes, Mara said. So will we. She opened her notebook to a fresh page, dated it, and began to write down everything she still needed to do. The words came quickly. They always did when the shape of something became clear. And the shape of this was becoming very clear, the full outline of it, the reach of it, the names at the edges she hadn't confirmed yet but would. It was the same shape she had seen before when she was 21 and too young and too trusting and too slow. She was none of those things now. She did not sleep much that night. Not because she was afraid. Fear was something she had learned to put aside like a tool she didn't currently need, setting it on a shelf and coming back to it later. What kept her awake was the particular tension of knowing that time had become a finite thing, countable now in hours rather than days, and that the work she had left to do required more of both than she was confident she had. She lay on her bed with the notebook on her chest and ran through the list in the dark. What she had, what she still needed, what Gideon Russ now knew and what he didn't. The gaps between those things were where everything would be decided. He had found her working ledger. He had seen the entries she had been making in the visible record. Careful entries, competent, the kind of organizing work a new bookkeeper would plausibly be doing in her second week. He had not found her personal notebook. He had not found the copies she had given to Thomas Aldred, who had already filed them with the registry clerk in Hargrove before they left. Whatever Gideon was planning to do next, he was doing it with incomplete information. That was the only advantage she had, and she intended to keep it as long as possible. By the time the sky outside her window went from black to deep blue, she was already dressed and sitting at the writing desk with her notebook open. She made a column on the left side of the page documents confirmed and a column on the right documents needed. The right side was longer, but not impossibly so. The important question was not whether she had enough. She had enough. The question was whether she could get it organized and documented and formally registered before Gideon moved in whatever direction he was moving. She heard Colter's boots in the hall at 5:15 and was in the kitchen with coffee ready when he came through. He looked at her and at the coffee and said nothing for a moment. "You slept," she said. "Some," he said, which she doubted. She poured him a cup, and he stood at the counter drinking it while she explained what she needed to do that day. He listened with the focused attention he brought to most things, no interruptions, no expressions of skepticism, just the particular quality of listening that meant he was actually filing what she said rather than waiting for his turn to speak. "I need access to the supply records going back 2 years," she said. "Not the ledger copies in the office, the original invoices. They're usually kept separately. There's a box in the storage room at the back of the main barn," he said. "Old receipts, delivery records. My father kept everything." "Rusk probably doesn't know that. He wouldn't know to look," Colter said. "He never showed much interest in anything that was already paid for." "Good." She pulled her notebook toward her. "I also need payroll records that predate Rusk's arrival. Anything that shows what the men were contracted to earn." "My father's desk," Colter said. "In the room off the parlor. It's been locked since he died." "I have the key." She looked at him. "And you haven't opened it?" A pause. "Not evasion, something else." "No," he said. She didn't press it. There were things people needed to do in their own time, and she had learned the difference between hesitation that was going to cause problems and hesitation that was simply human. This was the second kind. "When you're ready," she said. "Today, if possible." He finished his coffee and set the cup down. "Today," he said. The storage room at the back of the main barn was exactly what Colter had described. A low-ceilinged space with rough plank shelving on 3 sides, stacked with the accumulated documentation of decades of ranch operation. Mara stood in the doorway for a moment and took in the scope of it. There were crates, canvas-covered bundles, stacks of ledgers she had not seen before, and along the far wall, a set of wooden boxes labeled by year in the angular handwriting of a man who had taken record-keeping seriously. Hayes Sr. had been meticulous. That was the first thing she understood, moving through the room with a lantern. Every invoice was dated and sorted. Every delivery was logged. She found the supply records she needed in the third box, from the right 4 years of vendor invoices, signed receipts and purchase orders. She sat down on an upturned crate and began to work. It took her the better part of 3 hours. When she was finished, she had confirmed what she had suspected. The SISA costs in the office ledger had been inflated by between 15 and 30% across every category. Feed, lumber, wire, tools, harness equipment. Each line item in the official ledger was higher than the original invoice by a careful, irregular margin that was small enough to look like price variation if you weren't looking closely, but consistent enough to constitute a pattern if you were. Over 2 years, the skimmed amount came to just under $4,000 routed through the ghost vendor entries. $4,000 that had left the ranch's accounts and gone somewhere that was not Silver Creek. She wrote the total in her notebook and stared at it for a moment. Then she wrote below it, payroll shortfall estimated $6,000 across all hands. Then land transfer north pasture 240 acres, assessed value unknown but significant. The total picture was not a man helping himself to a convenient handful. This was systematic. This had been planned and executed and maintained over years, with enough care to survive casual inspection. The kind of scheme that required someone both confident in their own cleverness and contemptuous of everyone around them. She thought about Gideon's smile. The way it arrived a half-second late. She thought about her father's kitchen table and the man from the land consolidation company and the way her father had believed him because the man had been pleasant and patient and had answered every question in a way that sounded reasonable. She packed her notes and took the most critical original invoices, the ones she could cross-reference directly against the fraudulent ledger entries, and carried them carefully out of the barn. Colter was waiting for her near the main house with a key in his hand and an expression that was doing its best to be neutral and not quite managing it. She fell into step beside him without comment, and they went together to the room off the parlor. The room was small and south-facing, with a window that looked out over the near pasture. A roll-top desk against the east wall, a straight-back chair, a framed survey map of the ranch property pinned above the desk. The kind of room a man uses for quiet work, without visitors and without ceremony. Colter stood in the doorway for a moment after he unlocked it. Mara waited. He went in first, pulling the curtain back to let in the afternoon light, and she followed. She went to the desk and he went to the window, and she understood that he needed to look at something other than the room while she worked, so she didn't speak and she moved quietly. The roll-top opened stiffly, the mechanism wanting oil, and inside she found what she had hoped for, a separate set of payroll ledgers kept in the methodical hand she now recognized as Hayes Sr.'s. Every worker named, every wage rate recorded, every annual adjustment documented with a date and a reason. She found Boone Mercer's entry and ran her finger down the column. His contracted rate, the rate Hayes Sr. had set 6 years ago, and adjusted upward twice since was $2.40 per day. His current payroll entry in the office ledger listed $1.60. She found 4 more men and checked them all. Everyone was being paid between 55% and 65% of their contracted rate. Every one of the shortfall entries had been adjusted in the same fortnight 7 months ago, with no documented authorization and no notice to the workers. She wrote it all down. She was halfway through the 6th entry when Colter spoke from the window. He built this ranch in 22 years, he said. Bought the first 40 acres when he was 31 with the money he'd saved working other men's cattle. He was 48 before he had enough land to run a proper operation. He stopped. He didn't do things the easy way. He did them the right way. And it took longer, and he didn't complain about that. Mara kept writing. She let him talk. I left after a disagreement, Colter said. Not a small one. I thought he was being too cautious about expanding. There was good range land available to the north, reasonably priced, and he didn't want to take on the debt. We argued for 3 days, and then I left for Montana City and stayed gone for 8 months. He paused. He was already sick when I came back. We didn't have much time till we settled it. But there were things I would have said differently. He knew that, Mara said without looking up. You didn't know him? No. But I know that a man who built a ranch the way you're describing, who kept records like these, she touched the ledger, did not die, thinking his son hadn't come back because of a disagreement about acreage. He knew why you left, and he knew why you came back. Men like that generally do. The room was quiet. Outside, a cow lowed somewhere in the middle distance. I should have come back sooner, Colter said. Yes, Mara said. But you came back. She closed the ledger and began carefully removing the pages she needed to copy. She was working in the office that afternoon, the legitimate visible work, the surface-level organizing that was her cover when Boone Mercer appeared at the door. He rarely came to the main house, and the fact that he was here now, turning his hat in his hands in the careful way of a man, rehearsing what he is going to say, told her that something had shifted. Rusk talked to the men this morning, Boone said. She kept her eyes on the ledger in front of her. What did he say? Said there might be some irregularities in the accounts that he was working to straighten out. Said that if anyone was approached by outside parties asking questions about ranch finances, they should come to him directly. He paused. He used the word irregularities twice. Third time he used unauthorized, as in unauthorized access to private ranch records. Mara set down her pen. He was talking about me. Didn't say your name. Didn't have to. Boone came a step further into the room. 3 of the younger men, Hughes, Dalt, and the one they call Stick, they're scared. They don't know what's happening, but they know it's something, and scared men make bad decisions when someone in authority tells them there's a threat. What about the others? Boone looked at the floor for a moment. Tom Wyeth's been here 14 years. He's not going to do anything that puts his position at risk. Kellerman's the same. They've got families. He looked up, but they're not going to make trouble either. They just want to work. And you, I'm standing in this office talking to you, he said. That's where I am. She picked up her pen. Don't do anything different from your normal routine. Don't talk to the other men about this. If Rusk asks you anything directly, you answer whatever you feel you need to answer. I'm not asking you to lie for me. She paused. But if you see him moving documents or burning anything, or if anyone you don't recognize comes to the ranch, you let me know. And how do I do that without him knowing? You ride out to check the south fence every morning at first light, she said. I'll be at the creek crossing by the willow stand from now on, for about 20 minutes, before I come in for breakfast. If you need to tell me something, you tell me there. Boone looked at her for a moment. You've done this before. No, she said. But I've thought about how I would. He put his hat back on. Mara. He said her name like he was testing the sound of it. Judy Callahan figured out something was wrong. He was trying to get word out. He stopped. I don't know for certain that Rusk had anything to do with her leaving the way she did, but I know she was frightened, And I know she left without saying goodbye to a single person on this property. And I know she left in the middle of the night. The words landed and stayed. Thank you, Boone, she said. He nodded and left. Mara stared at the ledger page in front of her for a long time after he was gone. She was not thinking about the numbers. She was thinking about Judy Callahan, who had figured it out and tried to get word to the right person and left in the middle of the night because what? Because she'd been threatened? Because she'd been paid off? Because she'd lost her nerve? Mara didn't know. Maybe she would never know. But the knowledge of it sat on her chest like a stone, and she recognized it for what it was. A warning that she should not be careless, delivered too late to help the person it should have helped, and just in time to matter to her. She went back to work. She worked through the dinner hour and most of the evening. When she finally stopped, her hand was cramped and her eyes felt scraped. But the document she had been assembling, a clean, organized, chronological account of every fraudulent transaction she had identified, cross-referenced to original source documents, was complete. She put it in the bottom of her traveling satchel, under a folded change of clothes, where it looked like nothing. She met Colter at the creek crossing at 5:30 the next morning. He had been there before her, which meant he hadn't slept any more than she had. Rusk is planning something, she said. I know, he was watching the water. He sent a rider out last night, I don't know where. Toward town? South Road, not toward Hargrove. She thought about the directions between Silver Creek and the various points of interest. South meant either the county seat at Bitters Creek or the rail junction at Dunmore, where the telegraph office was. A message, she said, possibly, or a summons. He looked at her. Crane may be coming. How many men does Crane usually travel with? Colter's expression told her that the question was the right one, and the answer was not reassuring. Last time I saw him in Billings, at the bank he had 2 men with him, both carrying. Mara absorbed this without showing what she felt about it, which was that the situation was developing faster than her timetable had accounted for. She had planned for 3 more days of documentation work before making any overt move. 3 days was now probably 2 days too many. I need one more thing from the ranch records before we go back to Hargrove, she said. The original deed documents. I need to verify the specific legal description of the North Pasture and compare it to what was filed in the land transfer. My father's desk, Colter said, bottom left drawer. There's a leather portfolio. I need it today. I'll get it. And Colter. She looked at him directly. If Crane comes before we're ready, if anything starts to move before I've gotten the documentation to Aldred, we need a fallback. What kind of fallback? Someone else who knows what we know. Someone outside the ranch who can act if we can't. He considered this Aldred. I've already written him a letter. She pulled a folded envelope from her coat pocket. I need you to take it to the Hargrove postal rider when he comes through. He passes the East Road Junction on Thursdays. That's tomorrow. Yes, he took the envelope. He looked at the name on the front T. Aldred Hargrove Territorial Bank, and folded it once more and put it inside his jacket. What's in it? Everything, she said. If something happens here before we can get back to Hargrove, Aldred has enough to continue without us. They stood at the creek for a moment, the water moving past them with the indifferent industry of water that has somewhere to be. Nothing is going to happen to you, Colter said. The statement sat between them, and Mara considered saying several things in response. What she finally said was, I'm not planning on it. But I'm not Judy Callahan either. She picked up her satchel. Let's get back before breakfast. The leather portfolio from Hayes Sr.'s desk contained everything Mara needed, and several things she hadn't expected. The original deed documents were there, meticulously organized, with the legal survey descriptions she needed to cross-reference against the Crestfield Grazing Partners transfer. But tucked behind the property documents was a second set of papers she had not anticipated, correspondence between Hayes Sr. and a lawyer in Helena, dated 8 months before his death. She read the letters 3 times. Then she went and found Colter. He was at the paddock, checking the shoe on a roan mare. He looked up when she came, registered her expression, and stood. Your father knew something was wrong, she said, before he died. She handed him the first letter. He read it, standing at the paddock fence, the mare nudging his shoulder from behind and him not noticing. Hayes Sr. had written to the Helena lawyer, a man named Caulfield, about concerns he had with several transactions Gideon had conducted on the ranch's behalf. He had not known the full extent of it. He had not known about Crestfield Grazing Partners or the North Pasture transfer, which had come after his death. But he had seen enough to make him uneasy. He had asked Caulfield whether there were grounds for a formal audit. He had asked whether his son, whom he named, had standing to challenge any transactions conducted on the ranch's behalf after the owner's incapacitation. The lawyer had written back. The response was careful, professional, and ultimately of limited help to a dying man. But it established in writing that Hayes Sr. had raised concerns about Rusk before he died. He suspected him, Colter said. His voice was flat in the way voices go flat when a man is controlling something under the surface. Yes, and he wrote to a lawyer, who gave him cautious advice and no action. Colter handed the letter back. He was quiet for a moment, one hand resting on the paddock rail, and Mara watched his jaw tighten and then deliberately release. If I had been here, he started. You couldn't have known. I would have known something was wrong. I would have seen it, maybe, she said. But you can't know that. She put the letters back in the portfolio. What you can know is that your father was not taken completely by surprise. He saw something. He tried to act on it. The timing worked against him, not his judgment. Colter was quiet for a long moment. The mayor bumped his shoulder again, and this time he reached up and put his hand on her neck without looking. What do the letters do for us? He asked. They establish a pattern that predates my arrival, Mara said. They show that concerns about Rusk were documented by the property owner himself. That matters if there's any attempt to claim the investigation is recent or manufactured. She met his eyes. And they matter because they're one more thing Rusk doesn't know we have. She had been careful, but careful has limits. She discovered the limits at 3 o'clock that afternoon when she went to the storage room for the canvas bag of Judy Callahan's hidden ledgers, the records she had been leaving in place, meaning to retrieve them once she had everything else assembled and found the bag gone. She stood in the space where it had been and breathed carefully for a count of 5. It had been moved within the last 12 hours. She knew this because she had checked it the previous evening, and the bag had been exactly where she had found it the first time, wedged between the crate and the wall, undisturbed. Between yesterday evening and this afternoon, someone had gone into the stable storage room and taken it. The question of who had taken it was not complicated. The question of what Rusk intended to do with it was. If he was planning to destroy the records, he had made a tactical mistake. She had copied the most critical entries weeks ago, and the copies were not here. If he was planning to use them as evidence against her to claim she had stolen ranch documents, he was building toward something confrontational, which meant the timeline had shortened again. She walked directly from the stable to the main house, through the back door and down the hall, and knocked on the door of Gideon Rusk's office. He told her to come in. He was sitting behind his desk with his hands folded on top of it, and he was not surprised to see her, which told her everything she needed to know about the afternoon's sequence of events. He had taken the bag and then waited to see how long it took her to find out. He was timing her. I need to speak with you about the stable storage room, she said. Of course, he said. Sit down. She sat. She kept her notebook in her satchel, and her hands loose in her lap, and her expression at professional neutral, the face she had learned at 22 when she took her first bookkeeping position and discovered that the men she worked for often took her composure as evidence that nothing was wrong. I've been reviewing the historical records, she said. The original invoices in the storage room. I was planning to use them to cross-reference current supply costs. Yes, Gideon said. I know. It seems some of those records have been moved. Consolidated, he said, for security. We've had some concerns about unauthorized access to ranch documents. She let that settle for a moment. I see. As the bookkeeper, your access to current financial records is of course appropriate. He unfolded his hands and set them palms down on the desk. However, historical records, particularly those pertaining to prior property arrangements, are part of the ranch's legal holdings. I need to be careful about who handles them and in what context. He was watching her with the particular attention of a man who wants to see where a flinch is going to come from. She gave him nothing. Of course, she said. If there are restrictions on the historical records, I'll work within those parameters. She stood. I'll need to note in my working files that certain source documentation is unavailable for verification. For the record, the last 3 words landed the way she had aimed them, and she watched him process the implication that she might be creating a documented record of what she could and could not access. His smile appeared, a half-second late as always. I'm sure we can find an appropriate arrangement, he said. I'm sure, she agreed and left. She went to the creek crossing early the next morning, and Boone was already there, which meant he had seen something. Ryder came in from the south at dusk, he said, without preamble. Didn't come to the main house. Met Rusk in the equipment yard behind the second barn. I couldn't hear what they said, but the rider had a leather saddlebag, and he left without it. Mara thought about the southbound rider from 2 nights ago. Message sent, response received. Anything else? Rusk told Fran this morning she doesn't need to prepare the guest room. He paused. She hadn't been told to prepare it, which meant the guest room was being prepared by someone other than Fran, which meant someone was coming to Silver Creek whose Rusk did not want the household staff to know about. How long has Fran worked here? Mara asked. Long as I have. 12, 13 years. And she told you this voluntarily. Fran doesn't do anything voluntarily, Boone said. She does things because they need doing. Same with talking. He looked at the water. She told me because she thinks you need to know. Mara absorbed this. There was something in it, in the plain fact of Fran deciding, in her wordless practical way, to pass information along, that settled something in her chest. She was not as alone in this as the situation sometimes felt. "Someone is coming to Silver Creek," she said. "Within the next day, possibly tonight. I need to know when they arrive, who they are, and where they go first." "I'll be up," Boone said. "Don't take any risks." He looked at her with the expression of a man who has been managing risk on horseback since before she was born. "Wasn't planning on it," he said. She was almost back to the main house when the thought hit her fully, and she stopped walking. Rusk had the hidden ledgers. Rusk was expecting company. Rusk had just told her, in the careful language of a man preparing his position, that historical documents were being consolidated for security. He was not consolidating them for security. He was consolidating them because he was about to use them, or destroy them, or both, because whatever he was building toward, he wanted those records on his side of the table, not hers. She had copies of the most critical pages. She had the original invoices she had removed from the storage room before he got to them, now tucked under the spare blanket in her traveling satchel. She had the documentation already lodged with Aldred at the registry. But she did not have the physical originals of Judy Callahan's hidden ledgers anymore. And for certain kinds of legal proceedings, original documents carried a weight that copies did not. She stood in the yard and thought about this, and then went inside and did the thing she should have done. 3 days ago, she sat down and wrote a second letter to Thomas Aldred, longer and more specific than the first, detailing exactly what had been taken and exactly what she believed Rusk intended to do in the next 48 hours. She had it sealed and folded before noon. She gave it to Colter before supper without telling him what was in it, except to say the postal rider tomorrow. Make sure it gets there. He took it. He looked at her with the steady attention he had been giving her for days now, not watching her the way Rusk watched her, calibrating for weakness, but watching her the way a person watches someone they have decided to trust and are still getting used to the unfamiliarity of that decision. "We're almost out of time," he said. "Yes," she said. "Tell me what you need from me." She looked at him. He meant it in the practical way, what task, what action. But it landed differently, and she let it, just for a moment, before she answered, with the task, and the action, and the practical timetable. That was the answer he had asked for. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "We need to be on the road to Hargrove before Rusk knows we've gone." Colter nodded once. "And bring your father's letters," she said. "Aldred needs to see them." That night, Mara packed her satchel with everything she needed, placed it under her bed within reach, and lay down without undressing. She set her internal clock for 3 in the morning, which was a skill she had developed in childhood, on the farm, and refined through years of early departures and tight schedules. She stared at the ceiling and thought about Judy Callahan, leaving in the middle of the night, without saying goodbye to anyone. She thought about her father at his kitchen table, the papers spread in front of him, not fully understanding what he was looking at. She thought about Gideon Rusk's smile arriving a half-second late, every single time, like a translation from a language he had learned, rather than grown up speaking. She thought about Colter standing at the paddock fence with his hand on the mare's neck, not looking at anything, holding something very still and very carefully. She closed her eyes. She did not pray, because prayer had never been the habit she reached for. What she did instead was the same thing she always did at the end of a hard day, with more hard days still ahead. She went through the numbers. Everything she knew. Everything she could prove. Everything she still needed. The list was long. The time was short. The work was real. She could do real work. That was the one thing she had always been certain of. At 3 o'clock, her eyes opened on their own, and she sat up in the dark and reached for her satchel, and the day began. They rode out at 3:15 in the morning under a sky so thick with stars it almost gave enough light to see by. Almost. Colter rode slightly ahead, knowing the terrain well enough to navigate by feel and habit, and Mara followed his horse's silhouette and kept her satchel pressed against her side with one arm. Neither of them spoke until they were far enough from the ranch that speaking was safe. "Boone will notice we're gone by 5, Colter said. "He won't say anything, no. But Rusk will check the office when you don't appear for breakfast. Then we need to be in Hargrove by the time he figures out where we went." She shifted the satchel. "How long on this road?" 4 hours at a steady pace. "Less if we push." "Push," she said. They pushed. The road to Hargrove ran southeast through open country, dropping gradually from the ranch's elevated pasture land into the broader valley below. In the dark, it was a strip of pale dirt between black grass, and the horses moved along it with the steady rhythm of animals who had done this before. Mara used the time the way she always used, moving time, sorting and resorting what she knew, looking for gaps, rehearsing the presentation she was going to make when they arrived. She had the documentation organized in her satchel in the order she intended to present it. Supply invoices first. These were the clearest evidence. Original documents that could not be argued with. Then the payroll comparison, Hayes Sr.'s contracted rates against Rusk's modified entries. Then the property documents, with the legal description cross-reference she had completed 2 days ago. Then Hayes Sr.'s letters to the Helena lawyer, establishing prior knowledge and documented concern. And last, her own ledger, the clean, organized account she had spent 2 weeks assembling. Every entry dated and cross-referenced, every conclusion drawn from a source she could point to. It was good work. She had done good work before, and it had not always been enough. She was aware of that. The light came gradually, the sky going from black to a deep bruised blue in the east, and by the time they were an hour out from Hargrove, she could see the road clearly enough to let her mind rest from the navigation and settle back onto the problem. Rusk took Judy Callahan's ledgers, she said. Colter glanced at her. I know, he's going to try to use them, or destroy them. I can't tell which. If he destroys them, he loses his leverage. Yes, so he'll try to use them first. She looked at the road ahead. He's going to claim I took them from the office, that I removed them without authorization and falsified entries. She had been turning this possibility over for 2 days and had arrived at the shape of it, the specific argument Rusk would make, the way it would be framed, the evidence he would produce. He'll present me as a dishonest bookkeeper who was hired under false pretenses, who gained access to sensitive financial documents and manipulated them. It explains everything I've found as my own fabrication. And the original invoices? He'll say I altered them, or that they're not originals. She paused. It's not a strong argument, but it doesn't need to be strong. It just needs to create enough doubt to delay things. Delay gives him time to get the property transfer finalized. Or to disappear, she said. With Crane, if the scheme is as broad as I think it is, and things go wrong at Silver Creek, neither of them would wait around to explain themselves. Colter was quiet for a moment. How do we counter it? By being there first, she said. By having our documentation in the hands of the authorities, before he has the chance to make his case. By having Aldred standing behind our version of events. She straightened in the saddle. And by having something he doesn't know we have. She had been saving the letter from Hayes Sr. for this. Not because she had doubted its relevance, but because she had learned, from watching her father and from her own years of work, that the most important piece of evidence is the one your opponent doesn't know exists. Rusk knew what he had taken. He did not know what she had found in the locked desk. Your father's letters to the Helena lawyer, she said. Rusk doesn't know about those. Colter nodded slowly. He wouldn't. My father wouldn't have told him. They established that concerns about Rusk were documented by the property owner before his death, before my arrival, before anything I've collected. If Rusk argues that I fabricated the evidence, those letters predate me by over a year. She looked at Colter. He cannot forge a response to something he doesn't know exists. They reached Hargrove at 7:40 in the morning, which was later than she had hoped and earlier than she had feared. The town was already moving the dry goods store open. Horses tied in front of the stage office, 2 men in conversation outside the courthouse steps. The ordinary business of an ordinary morning, indifferent to what was about to happen inside it. Thomas Aldred was at his desk when they arrived at the bank. He looked up when the clerk showed them in and read their expressions with the quick assessment of a man who has been reading rooms full of anxious people for 40 years. Close the door, he said to the clerk, and then to Mara. Tell me, she told him. She was efficient about it, no dramatic framing, no unnecessary lead-up, just the sequence of events since their last meeting laid out in the order they had occurred, the search of her office, Rusk's meeting with her and the language he had used, the missing ledgers, Boone Mercer's informations about the overnight rider in the guest room, the letters from Hayes Sr. She put the letters on the desk when she reached that point, and Aldred picked them up and read them without hurrying, and when he was finished, he set them down with the care of a man handling something fragile. Samuel Hayes wrote to Caulfield, he said. I know Caulfield. Solid man. He was cautious in his advice because cautious is all he could be at that stage. Hayes didn't have enough yet to make a formal complaint. He looked at Colter. But your father saw it. Yes, Colter said, that matters. Aldred folded his hands. Now, what do you need from me today, specifically? 3 things, Mara said. First, I need you to accompany us to the county registry and request that the provisional hold be converted to a full legal challenge. The hold we filed 2 days ago only buys time. We need a formal proceeding initiated. On what grounds? Fraud in the execution of the transfer documents. The signatory Hayes Sr. was deceased at the time of the most recent notarization. I have the death certificate date and the notarization date. They don't match. Aldred's eyes sharpened. You're certain? I checked it 4 times, she said. The North Pasture transfer was notarized 6 weeks after Samuel Hayes died. The room was very quiet. Second, Mara continued, I need you to send a telegram to the Territorial Land Office in Helena. flagging Crestfield Grazing Partners as a subject of fraud investigation and requesting any other registrations under that entity name or associated names. Crane, Colter said. Aldous Crane, Mara confirmed. And any entity associated with him Aldred was already writing. And third, I need a witness, she said. Someone with standing in this county who can attest that these documents were presented to him in good faith before any counterclaim was made. Someone Russ cannot dismiss as a partisan. Aldred looked up from his notes. You're expecting him to claim you manufactured this. I'm expecting him to claim exactly that, she said. And I would rather have the counter-argument built before he makes it. Aldred sat back. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man running calculations that are not mathematical. There is a territorial land inspector, a man named Graves, who has been quietly looking at property transfer irregularities in this region for the past 18 months. I have a connection to him through the banking association. He paused. He has not been able to move on anything because he has not had sufficient documented evidence. What you are describing, he gestured at the stack of documents on his desk, is the kind of thing he has been looking for? Mara went still. How quickly can you reach him? Telegraph this morning. Then we should be at the registry when it opens, she said. Aldred was already standing. The county registry of Hargrove occupied a narrow room between the surveyor's office and the hardware store, staffed by the same nervous clerk, Ferris, who had processed their provisional hold 2 days before. He looked at Mara with the expression of a man who had hoped she would not be back, and then he looked at Thomas Aldred standing beside her and recalibrated. Mr. Aldred, he said. Morning, Ferris, Aldred said pleasantly. We have some documents to file. What followed was 2 hours of the particular tedium that accompanies important legal moments, forms completed, documents stamped, copies made and certified, Ferris disappearing twice into the back room to consult references he should have known by memory, and returning with the careful expression of someone who has confirmed what they already knew but needed to check anyway. Colter stood near the wall and said almost nothing. Aldred managed the procedural elements with the calm authority of a man who had been doing this since the clerk was a child. Mara sat at the counter and answered every question with precision, and produced every document at the exact moment it was requested. When it was done, the formal challenge filed, the death certificate discrepancy officially entered into the record, the supplementary documentation. Certified Ferris stamped the final page and handed it across the counter and said, There will need to be a hearing. I know, Mara said. When? These things take time to schedule. We don't have time, she said. I need to speak to the county land commissioner directly. Ferris blinked. Commissioner Whitmore is available, Aldred said. I'll see to it. Where is he this morning? 20 minutes later, they were in the commissioner's office, a real office, not a registry counter, with windows and chairs and a man behind the desk who looked at the stack of documents Mara had brought and did not immediately dismiss her. Commissioner Whitmore was in his late 60s, gray-haired, heavy-set, with the deliberate movements of a man who tried rushing decades ago and had decided this served him better. He read. He asked questions, he read again. When he was done, he looked at Colter. You're Samuel Hayes' son. Yes, sir. I knew your father, he said it without elaboration, and the absence of elaboration was itself a kind of statement. He looked at Mara. You compiled this? Yes. In how long? 19 days. He looked at the documents again. The notarization discrepancy is the critical point, he said. If the transfer was executed after Samuel Hayes' death using his signature, then the document is a forgery, and the transfer is void on its face. He set the papers down. I'm issuing an emergency protection order on the Silver Creek North pasture pending a formal fraud investigation. No further transfers, no development, no claims against the property until this is adjudicated. He looked at Aldred. You'll need to reach Graves. Already done, Aldred said. I sent the telegraph before we came here. Whitmore nodded once with the satisfaction of a man who finds that others have anticipated him. Then we wait to hear from him. He looked at Mara. Where are you staying? Silver Creek Ranch, she said. His expression shifted slightly. You're going back. Yes, Miss Whitlock. He chose his next words with the care of a man who does not want to be misunderstood. The man who orchestrated this arrangement is still on that property. You have now set in motion proceedings that will cost him significantly financially and legally. People in that position sometimes make poor decisions. I know, she said. I'm not sure you fully understand what I'm telling you, Commissioner. She met his eyes. I grew up watching a man like this take my family's farm through forged documents. I have spent 19 days collecting evidence in the same house as him while he searched my office and intimidated workers and sent overnight riders to associates I haven't fully identified yet. I understand exactly what you're telling me. She picked up her satchel. But the original documents he needs to counter our evidence are still at Silver Creek. I can't get them from here. Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. Be careful, he said. I'm always careful, she said. It just doesn't always look like it from the outside. They were back on the road to Silver Creek by midday. Colter rode beside her this time rather than ahead, and the shift was small and said nothing explicit and meant something anyway. "You told Whitmore you grew up watching someone do this to your family," he said. It was not a question. "I did. You haven't told me the full story." She rode for a moment before answering. "My father was a farmer in Missouri. Good land, good operation. He built it himself over 20 years. When I was 19, a man came through selling what he called agricultural consolidation arrangements, a way to pool resources with neighboring farms. He said, reduce costs, improve negotiating position with the grain buyers." She kept her eyes on the road. My father was not a foolish man. He asked questions. The man had answers for all of them. The documents looked legitimate. My father had a lawyer look at them, a local man who practiced property and contracts, and the lawyer said they appeared to be in order. They weren't. The arrangement transferred a controlling interest in the farm to a holding company. My father retained the right to work the land and a share of the profits, but control of the property itself, including the right to sell, transferred to this company. My father thought he understood what he had signed. He had not understood it. She paused. 18 months later, the holding company sold the farm. Legally, they had the right. We had 60 days to leave. Colter said nothing for a moment. "How old were you?" 21 by then. I had been keeping the farm's books for 2 years. I went back through everything, after every document, every correspondence, every entry my father had signed. She watched the road. I found 4 specific points in the original contract where the language was deliberately constructed to obscure what was being agreed to. Legal language that meant something different from what the plain reading suggested. Things a lawyer who specialized in agricultural fraud would have caught, and a general practitioner had missed. She paused. I wrote it all out. I took it to the county attorney. What happened? He told me the contract had been legally executed, that my father had signed it, that the appropriate time to challenge the terms had been before signing, not after. She said this without bitterness, which took a moment. He was not wrong. He was just not helpful. "And the man who sold your father the arrangement? Gone. Different county, different name probably. I never found him." She shifted in the saddle. But I understood after that how it was done, what to look for, how the language was constructed to mislead, how the documents were organized to hide the critical terms in plain sight. She looked at Colter. "That's what I mean when I say I've done something like this before. I've seen the shape of it. I know what it looks like from the inside." He rode for a while without responding, and she let the silence sit. She had told the story efficiently, without the emotional weight she usually kept packed around it, and she was aware of that the choice of efficiency over feeling, which was its own kind of protection that she did not always entirely trust. "Your father," Colter said finally, "what happened to him?" "He worked for other people after that," she said. "He was good at it. He didn't complain." She looked at the horizon. "He died when I was 26. Farm work, an accident. He was working land that wasn't his." She said this last part without inflection, and then was quiet. Colter didn't offer anything to fill the quiet, which she appreciated more than she would have appreciated words. They were an hour from Silver Creek when they saw the rider coming toward them on the road moving fast. Not a casual pace, the kind of speed that meant something. Colter straightened in his saddle and put his hand briefly near his side. The rider was Boone Mercer. He pulled up hard when he reached them, his horse blowing and his expression carrying the controlled urgency of a man who has been riding fast and thinking faster. He looked at Mara first, then Colter, and then back at Mara. "Crane came," he said. Mara felt the information land in her chest like something dropped from a height. "When this morning?" 2 hours after you left. Came with 2 men, like Colter said. Went straight to Rusk's office." Boone wiped his face with the back of his hand. "They've been in there most of the morning. About an hour ago I heard Rusk shouting. First time I've ever heard him raise his voice. What was he shouting about? Couldn't make out the words. But Crane came out first, and he didn't look pleased. Stewed in the yard for about 10 minutes smoking and not talking to anyone. Then he went back inside." Boone looked at Colter. "They know you went to Hargrove." "How? Don't know. Could be someone on the road recognize you. Could be someone in town." He paused. "There's more. The 2 men Crane brought, they've been going through the outbuildings. Not searching exactly, more like taking inventory, walking through spaces, looking at what's there." He glanced at Mara. "They went through the stable. The storage room," she said. "Spent 20 minutes in there." She had removed the critical invoices before they left. But if there was anything she had missed, anything she had overlooked in the 3 weeks of careful work, they would have it now. She ran through the inventory in her head, methodical, systematic, checking each category of document against what she had taken. There was nothing left in the stable storage room that they didn't already have copies of elsewhere. "They're not going to find what they're looking for," she said. "That might make things worse," Boone said. "Yes," she agreed. "It might." Colter looked at her. We go back, she said. but not through the front gate. They came in through the east pasture, dismounting at the far fence and tying the horses to a post half a mile from the main yard. Boone went ahead to check the position of Crane's men, and Mara and Colter waited in the shadow of the fence line with the dry grass moving around them in the afternoon heat. Mara used the time to go through her satchel one more time, not from anxiety from method. She checked every document, confirmed the order, confirmed that nothing had shifted or been damaged on the road. She was on the third document when Colter spoke. "When this is over," he said, "whatever that looks like, you'll leave." She looked up from the papers. "That's not a question." No, she considered what to say. "I have work to finish first." "I know that. After that, I don't know yet." She looked at the document in her hands. "The territorial authorities have asked me before, after previous situations, if there was ever interest in working on fraud cases at a larger scale." She paused. "I always said I wasn't suited to institutional work. Were you?" "Probably not. But that was a different reason from the one I gave." She put the document back in the satchel. "The actual reason was that I wasn't ready to be in one place long enough to matter to anyone." Colter was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light was doing something complicated to the pasture grass, turning it between gold and green in the intermittent wind. "You matter here," he said. "For what it's worth." She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was watching the direction Boone had gone, tracking the distance, and the words had been said with the particular evenness of someone who says what they mean and then waits to see what happens to it. She turned back to her satchel and did not answer right away. What she was feeling was something she did not have a clean category for, not discomfort, not dismissal. Something more complicated than either, and she was not a person who trusted complicated feelings when there was still work left to do. "It's worth something," she said finally. "I'll think about the rest later." He nodded once. It was the right response, and they both knew it. Boone came back at a low trot. "Crane's men are in the south yard. Rusk is in the main house. I don't know where Crane is." "Then we go in through the kitchen," Mara said. "Fran's door." Fran opened the kitchen door before they knocked, which meant she had been watching for them, which meant she had been keeping her own particular watch on the situation in the way she did most things, without announcement and without sentimentality. She looked at them for a moment. Then she moved aside. They came through the kitchen, and Mara paused at the table, the same table saw where she had drunk her first cup of coffee on her first morning, asking Fran whether she liked working here and getting the answer that was not an answer. "Where is Crane?" Colter asked Fran. "The parlor," Fran said. "With Rusk." She wiped her hands on her apron. "They have the ledgers on the table. The old ones, the ones from the stable." She said this to Mara specifically. "They've been going through them for 2 hours." Mara's hand tightened on her satchel. "Are they alone?" "One of Crane's men is at the front door. The other's somewhere outside. I don't know where." Mara looked at Colter. He was already calculating the same thing. She was 2 men with unclear positions, Rusk and Crane in the parlor with documents that Rusk believed gave him leverage. The moment they walked through that door, the situation became public in a way that could not be undone. Everything she had built in the past 3 weeks would be committed, exposed, tested. She thought about Commissioner Whitmore's protection order, sitting in the registry office in Hargrove. She thought about Aldred's telegram to the Territorial Inspector Graves. She thought about the letter she had put in the postal rider's bag that morning, with everything documented in her clearest hand. She had built the wall before she walked up to it. "That had always been the plan, all right," she said. "We go in." The parlor door was half open. She pushed it the rest of the way and walked through without knocking, which was the correct choice because knocking would have given them time to compose themselves, and she wanted them exactly as they were. Rusk was on his feet immediately. She had expected that. What she had not expected was Crane, who remained seated, which told her something important about the relative power in the room. Crane was in his 50s, heavier than she had imagined from Colter's description, with a broad, flat face and the particular stillness of a man who has been in difficult rooms before and learned not to give anything away by moving. He looked at her. He looked at Colter. Something moved across his face that was not quite recognition and not quite surprise. "Mr. Hayes," Rusk said. And the use of the name, the real name, the name he had been not using for 3 weeks, was its own kind of admission. "I think there are some things we need to discuss." "Yes," Colter said, "there are." Rusk's eyes moved to Mara's satchel. She watched him calculate what was in it and how much it mattered. "Miss Whitlock," he said, and now the pleasantness was entirely gone, replaced by something cleaner and colder. "I'm afraid I have to tell you that in reviewing the historical accounts, I've discovered some serious irregularities, entries that appear to have been altered." He looked at Crane, a brief look, coordinating. "I'll need to bring this to the authorities' attention." "You'll need to be more specific," Mara said. "Which entries?" "Several entries in the accounts you've been managing." "I haven't been managing historical accounts," she said. "I've been reviewing them. The accounts I've managed since my arrival are the current records. which I've kept accurately and can document completely. She opened her satchel. If you're referring to discrepancies in the historical records, I've documented those as well, along with their source. Rusk's expression flickered. What source? She laid the first stack of documents on the parlor table. The original invoices, organized chronologically. The payroll comparison. The property documents. Those supply invoices predate my arrival by 2 years, she said. The entries in the ledger that don't match them were made by whoever was managing the accounts before I came. I can account for my own work. Someone else will need to account for theirs. Crane had not moved. He was looking at the documents on the table with the expression of a man recalculating his position, and Mara watched him do it and felt the momentum of the room shift. In a way, she recognized the specific tilt of a situation that has been prepared for carefully and is now moving in the direction it was prepared to move. Then Rusk made his mistake. He picked up one of the documents from the table, not one of hers, one of Judy Callahan's hidden ledgers that he had taken from the stable, and he said, "These records were removed from ranch files without authorization." "Those records were not in the ranch files," Marcia said. "They were hidden in the stable storage room, in a canvas bag, behind a crate." She looked at him steadily. "The question is why a set of accurate payroll and supply records would need to be hidden in the stable rather than kept in the office." "You put them there," Rusk said. "I found them there," she said. "On my 9th day at this ranch, I left them in place because I didn't want to disturb the evidence." She paused. The evidence of what was in them and what they showed. Crane spoke for the first time. His voice was measured, the voice of a man who charges by the hour and speaks accordingly. "Miss Whitlock, you're a bookkeeper. You were hired to organize accounts. What you're describing sounds like an investigation you were not authorized to conduct." "I was hired to organize accounts," she said, "and in doing so, I found accounts that had been deliberately falsified. A bookkeeper who found that and did nothing about it would be either incompetent or complicit." She met his eyes. "I'm neither. You've taken documents off this property. I've provided copies to the county registry in Hargrove, along with a formal challenge to the North Pasture Land transfer. The transfer is currently under an emergency protection order, signed by Commissioner Whitmore." She reached into the satchel and placed the certified copy on the table. "Filed this morning." Rusk went still. Crane looked at the certified copy for a long moment. "The notarization date on the transfer document is 6 weeks after Samuel Hayes' death," Mara said. "The death certificate and the notarization date are both matters of public record. That transfer was executed using a dead man's signature, which makes it a forgery, which makes it void, and which makes everyone who participated in its execution subject to prosecution for fraud." The room was very quiet. Crane stood up. He did it slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who is deciding something as he moves. He looked at Rusk with an expression that was not fury and not panic. It was the specific look of a man identifying who in the room is responsible for the situation he is in. And then Gideon Rusk, who had spent 3 years being careful and controlled, and always arriving at his smile a half-second late, did the thing that Mara had been waiting for, the thing that careful men do when they feel the walls is moving. He panicked. "This wasn't only Silver Creek," he said. The words came out faster than he intended. "You think I put this together alone? Crane has been running this operation across 6 properties in this territory. I was one piece of it. One piece." He was looking at Crane as he spoke, and what was on his face now was something unplanned, the exposure of a man who has just realized that his position in a collapsing arrangement is not what he thought it was. Crane said nothing. He looked at Rusk with an expression of absolute cold. "6 properties," Colter said. "At least 6, Rusk said, and then stopped, as though he had only now heard himself. Mara wrote nothing down. She kept everything in her head and her face as still as she could manage, because the room had just changed, had expanded. Suddenly, from one ranch in Silver Creek to something much larger, and she needed to think clearly about what it meant and what to do next, and she needed Rusk to keep talking before he thought better of it. "How many of the property owners are still living?" she asked. Rusk looked at her. Something was happening in his face, the collapse of one strategy, and the beginning, halting and desperate, of another. "Most of them," he said. "Some where the arrangements were made with surviving family members. Hires." He stopped again. "I want to talk to the territorial authority. Before anything else, I want to talk to them first." Crane took a step toward the door. "Don't," Colter said. His voice was quiet. It did not need to be loud. Crane stopped. Mara looked at the man she had spent 3 weeks trying to understand and said, "Mr. Rusk, whatever you tell the territorial authority, you will tell them in the presence of witnesses and with every statement documented. If you want that conversation to go in a direction that helps your situation, then you will sit down, and you will tell me the names." The room held its shape for a long moment, Crane at the door, Rusk in the center of it, Colter near the window, and Mara at the table with her hands flat on the surface and her satchel open and 3 weeks of careful documented work laid out in front of her. Rusk sat down. He began to talk. Rusk talked for a long time. He talked the way men talk when they have decided that cooperation is the better bet, not freely, not with any particular remorse, but with the methodical calculation of someone trading information for position. He chose what to give and what to hold back, and Mara could see him doing it, but she let it run, because even the edited version of what he was saying was more than she had 2 hours ago. The operation had been Crane's design from the beginning. That was the first thing Rusk made clear, with the emphasis of a man establishing distance between himself and the most serious charges. Crane had identified a pattern ranches that had recently lost a patriarch, properties where the heir was absent or disengaged, estates where the legal paperwork was complicated enough that a careful insertion could go unnoticed for years. He had developed a methodology over time, refining it with each property, learning from the places where earlier attempts had nearly unraveled. Silver Creek had been his 4th operation in Montana territory. There were 2 others currently active. Rusk named them, giving Mara enough to write down even though she was writing nothing, storing it in the part of her mind she had trained since she was 21 to hold exactly this kind of information without losing a word of it. Ranch names, county locations, the approximate stage of the scheme at each property. Crane's 2 men had not moved from their positions during any of this. The one at the front door had been joined by Boone Mercer, who had appeared silently from the direction of the kitchen and now stood in the parlor doorway with his arms at his sides and said nothing. The second of Crane's men had come in from outside when Colter went to the front door and asked him to, using a tone that did not suggest the man had much of a choice. He sat now in the corner of the parlor with the look of someone reviewing his employment decisions. Crane himself had not spoken again after Rusk began talking. He had returned to his chair and sat there with the particular stillness of a man conserving something. His face gave nothing. His hands were folded in his lap. He watched Rusk the way a man watches weather he cannot change and has decided to simply wait out. When Rusk reached the end of what he was willing to say voluntarily, the room went quiet. Mara let the quiet sit for a moment and then said, "The hidden accounts. Where are they held?" Rusk looked at Crane. Crane looked at the wall. "Rusk," Colter said. "There's a bank in Bitters Creek," Rusk said, "under the Crestfield name, and another account in Dunmore at the Rail Junction Bank under a different entity." He paused. "I don't have access to the Dunmore account. That's Crane's, but you know it exists." "I know it exists." Mara looked at Crane. "Is there anything you want to add?" Crane looked at her with the expression he had been maintaining since Rusk started talking flat, patient, almost bored. "I'll speak to a lawyer," he said, "not to you." "That's your right," she said. "Though I'd point out that the Territorial Inspector's Office is already aware of this property, and at least one other. The names of the remaining properties are going to be in my report regardless of whether you confirm them." She paused. "The only variable is whether your cooperation is documented before or after the investigation reaches you." Something moved in Crane's face, not much, but something. "I'll speak to a lawyer," he said again. But the second time it sounded less like a position and more like a delay. The Territorial Inspector arrived the following morning. His name was Graves, Marshal Graves, and he came with 2 deputies and a manner that was neither theatrical nor tentative. He was in his mid-40s, lean, with the particular quality of attention that Mara recognized in people who had spent years looking at things other people had tried to hide. He shook her hand when Aldred introduced them and looked at her the way people look at someone whose written work they have already read and are now calibrating against the original. "Your documentation is thorough," he said. It was not flattery. It was an assessment. "Thank you," she said. "The notarization discrepancy, you found that in the first week?" "The 9th day," she said. "I didn't confirm it until I could cross-reference the death certificate at the registry." He nodded. "All right. Walk me through it from the beginning." She did. She was on her 3rd telling of the sequence of events, first to Aldred, then to Commissioner Whitmore, now to Graves, and each time she told it, she felt the story compressed slightly, the essential facts clarifying, the peripheral details falling away. Graves listened with a focused economy, occasionally asking a question that was surgical in its precision, not asking for elaboration but for a specific fact she had not explicitly stated, demonstrating that he was following the construction of the argument rather than just the narrative. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The 2 properties Rusk named," he said. "Hendricks Creek and the Mallory Ranch outside Copperfield. I've had flags on both for 6 months. Not enough to move on." He looked at her documentation spread across Aldred's banking office table. "This gives me enough. What happens to Silver Creek?" Colter asked. He had been standing near the window in the same position he had taken in Commissioner Whitmore's office, not removed from the conversation, but giving it room. "The protection order holds pending the fraud investigation." The North Pasture transfer is void pending formal adjudication given the notarization discrepancy. That should be a straightforward proceeding. The fraudulent transfer can't be executed. Graves looked at Colter directly. Your ranch isn't going anywhere. Colter nodded. He said nothing else, but something in his posture changed a small release barely visible. The kind of thing you would only notice if you had been watching him as closely as Mara had been watching him for 3 weeks. Russ, Graves said. He's prepared to give a written statement? He said as much last night, Mara said. I'd recommend getting it before he has time to reconsider or consult with Crane. Already planned. Graves looked at one of his deputies. Separooms. Rusk first. The written statement took most of the morning. Mara was not in the room for it. Graves was professional enough not to need her there, and she was tired enough to accept the exclusion without argument. She sat in Aldred's outer office with a cup of coffee that went cold and her notebook open to a fresh page, and for the first time in 3 weeks, that she did not know what to write. The immediate work was done. The next set of work, the formal investigation, the adjudication proceedings, the recovery of stolen funds, was Graves's work, and Aldred's, and the county commissioners, and eventually a series of lawyers and judges and institutional processes that would run their course without needing her to manage them. She had handed the machine its fuel. The machine would run. She turned the notebook to the documentation she had compiled for Graves and read through it one more time, checking for gaps she might have missed. There were 2 minor entries she wanted to clarify, and 1 source notation she had been imprecise about, and she made the corrections in the margin, in her small, careful handwriting. Then she closed the notebook. Colter came and sat across from her at 10:20. He brought fresh coffee, which she had not asked for and was grateful for. Rusk's been talking for 2 hours, he said. That's a good sign, she said. Graves sent his deputy to Bitters Creek, to the bank. Also good. He wrapped his hands around his own cup. Aldred says the recovery process on the stolen wages will take time. The Crestfield account in Bitters Creek has funds, but there are legal steps before the men can be paid. Weeks or months most likely. For the full amount. He paused. I'll pay the men from operating funds in the meantime. The difference between what Rusk was giving them and what they were owed. That I can do now, she looked at him. You've thought about this. Last night, he said, while you were writing the report for Graves. You should tell Boone first, she said, before the others. He's been carrying this longer than anyone. Colter looked at his coffee cup. I know, he was quiet for a moment. Boone should be running the ranch operations. He's been doing the work of a head wrangler for years without the title or the pay. That changes today. He'll argue, she said. I know that too. The corner of his mouth moved. He'll argue and then he'll accept it because he's practical and because he's been waiting for someone to simply do the right thing for long enough that he's not going to turn it down when it finally happens. Mara thought about Boone at the creek, crossing in the gray early mornings, turning his hat in his hands, giving her information at personal risk because he had decided it was the right thing to do and then done it without drama. She thought about Fran opening the kitchen door before they knocked. Small acts of courage that didn't look like courage because they were so quietly done. This place has good people in it, she said, under everything Rusk put on top of it. Yes, Colter said, it does. Graves emerged from the back office at noon with the written statement and the expression of a man who has gotten more than he expected and is recalibrating the scope of his next 6 months. He named 7 properties, Graves said, standing at the office door with the statement folded in his hand. 7, across 3 counties. Crane has been operating this methodology for at least 5 years. He looked at Mara. Your instinct about the pattern was correct. These are all properties that experienced recent ownership transitions. Grieving families, absent heirs, people in complicated legal situations who needed help and got the wrong kind. She thought about her father, the man from the land consolidation company. The answers for every question. What happens to Crane? Colter asked. Crane is going to have a very difficult few years, Graves said with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating weather conditions. The question is whether he cooperates and how quickly. He's still holding to the lawyer position, which is his right. But with Rusk's statement and your documentation, he looked at Mara again. He doesn't have a strong hand. He knows that, she said. He's been calculating it since yesterday. He'll cooperate eventually. He'll want the terms of it established early, before the investigation reaches the other properties, and the picture gets worse for him. Graves considered this. You have a good instinct for how these men think. I've studied the type, she said. He almost smiled. I'm going to need a formal statement from you as well. For the record, I know. I can have it written by this afternoon. And Miss Whitlock. He paused in the professional way of a man about to say something that is outside the standard procedure. The Territorial Land Office has been trying to build this kind of investigative capacity for 2 years. The kind of work you've done here, the documentation, the cross-referencing. The legal cross-referencing, that's not common. Most people who find evidence of this kind of fraud either don't know what they're looking at or don't know how to present it in a way the legal process can use. He paused. I'd like to talk to you about a more formal arrangement after things settle. She looked at him steadily. I'll think about it, she said, which was more than she had said the last time someone had made a version of this offer, and she noted the difference without deciding what it meant yet. They rode back to Silver Creek in the late afternoon, Mara, Colter, and Graves with his 2 deputies, Crane in the custody of 1 deputy, and a second rider carrying the formal documentation that would begin the process of unwinding 3 years of careful theft. The ranch looked the same from the road. It always looked the same from the road. Mara had learned in the past 3 weeks that the distance between how a place looked and what was happening inside it could be very large indeed, and she thought this probably applied to most things. Boone was at the gate when they came through. He looked at the composition of the party Graves's badge, Crane in a position that made his status clear, Mara and Colter riding side by side, and read it accurately without anyone having to explain. He looked at Colter. It's mostly, Colter said. The beginning of done, Boone nodded. He looked at Mara. You all right tired, she said honestly, but yes. The other men had come into the yard by then, drawn by the arrival of authority and the particular quality of a moment that feels like something shifting. Tom Wyeth, 14 years at Silver Creek, standing near the paddock with his hat in his hand. The younger men Hughes, Dalt, the one called Stick, in a loose group near the barn, not certain what they were watching but understanding it mattered. Fran at the kitchen door, arms crossed, expression unreadable as always, but her eyes moving across the group with the attention of someone cataloging who was present and what condition they were in. Colter dismounted and stood in the center of the yard and waited until the noise of horses and movement settled. Gideon Rusk has been removed from his position, he said. He said it the way he said most things, without embellishment, without performance, in a volume that carried without effort. The territorial inspector is here to take custody of him and to begin an investigation into the mismanagement of this ranch's accounts. The short version of it is this: the wages you've been receiving for the past 7 months were not your full wages. The difference is owed to you and will be paid. He paused. Starting today. Out of operating funds until the legal recovery process is complete. The yard was quiet in the way of a space that is absorbing something it was not certain it would ever hear. Hughes, who was 23 and had been at Silver Creek for 2 years, and had the particular expression of a young man who has been enduring something he didn't know how to fight, said, All of it? Everything short? Every dollar, Colter said. Hughes looked at the ground and nodded, and Mara watched his jaw work for a moment, in the way of someone managing something he was not going to show in the yard, and she looked away because some moments deserved their privacy. Colter looked at Boone. I want to talk to you separately, he said. When you have a minute. Boone's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Now's fine, he said. They walked toward the paddock together, and Mara watched them go, the 2 men, the one who had been here 30 years, and the one who had left and come back, and the particular ease with which they moved together that spoke of something longer than the immediate crisis, some older familiarity that had survived the years and the distance and was now finding its footing again. She took her satchel and went to the office. Not because there was urgent work waiting, but because the office was where she thought clearly, and she had a statement to write for Graves, and the familiar architecture of documentation was the right thing to do with her hands, while everything else settled around her. She was an hour into the statement when Fran appeared at the door with a plate of food, set it on the edge of the desk, and left without comment. Mara ate without stopping writing. The statement took another hour to complete, comprehensive, clearly organized, beginning with her first day at the ranch and ending with Rusk's disclosure in the parlor, every relevant fact, dated and attributed. She read it through twice, made 3 small corrections, and set it aside for Graves. Then she sat back and looked at the shelves of ledgers. They looked different now. She wasn't sure exactly what the difference was. The objects were the same, the rooms was the same, but something in the quality of their presence had changed. For 3 weeks she had looked at those shelves as a crime scene organized to resemble a filing system. Now they were simply records again. Imperfect ones, damaged by years of manipulation, but beginning the long process of becoming accurate. She would need to go through all of them, properly, methodically, rebuilding the accounts from the verified source documents up. It would take months. It would require cross-referencing every entry against originals, reconstructing the true financial picture of Silver Creek Ranch across the years of Rusk's management, identifying every dollar that had been moved and where it had gone. It was, she realized, exactly the work she was best at in the world. She was still thinking about this when Colter came back from the paddock. He came into the office and looked at the statement on the desk and then at her. Boone cried, he said. She looked up. when I told him about the head wrangler position. He turned away first, and it took him a moment, but he stopped. I've known Boone Mercer since I was 8 years old. I've never seen him do that. Mara thought about Boone at the fence line, mending the downed post, telling her about Judy Callahan without looking at her. 30 years he had worked this land. He'd watched the man who built it die. He'd watched what came after, and he hadn't left, and he hadn't bent, and he'd turned his hat in his hands in the office doorway, and told her what she needed to know, even though it cost him something to do it. He earned it, she said. Yes, Colter said he did. He sat down across from her. Graves is taking Rusk and Crane to Bitters Creek tonight, the formal custody process. He'll be back in 2 weeks to continue the investigation here. I'll have the accounts ready, she said. Colter looked at her steadily. How long will the full accounting take? 3 months, if I work through it properly. Maybe less if the Bitters Creek bank records are accessible. There may be records in Rust files that help correspondence, external ledgers. She paused. It's not simple work. No, he said. But you're staying to do it. It was not quite a question. Not quite a statement either. It was the particular construction of a sentence that leaves room for the answer to go in more than one direction, without presuming which direction it will go. She thought about what she had said at the paddock fence that afternoon, with the grass moving around them, and the question of what came next, sitting unanswered between them. She thought about Graves's offer. She thought about her mother in Missouri, who had not heard from her in 6 months, and did not know where she was or what she had been doing, or that the work she had spent 5 years building toward had, in the last 3 weeks, finally found its shape. I'm staying, she said. For the work, of course, he said. And she stopped, started differently, and possibly for other reasons, that I haven't entirely sorted out yet. Colter looked at her with the expression she had been cataloging for 3 weeks and still did not have a complete name for the one that was not quite neutral and not quite anything simpler than that. Take your time, he said. The accounts aren't going anywhere. She looked at him for a moment. That was almost a joke. Almost, he agreed. She turned back to the statement on the desk. Outside, the yard was quieter than it had been in months, not the tense quiet of people suppressing themselves, but the quieter quality of a place that had put something down and not yet picked up what came next. From somewhere near the paddock, she could hear Boone's voice, low and even, talking to one of the horses or one of the men, and the sound of it was ordinary in the way that things are ordinary when they are finally allowed to be. The light through the office window went from gold to amber, and Mara finished the last line of her statement, and set down her pen and straightened the pages and told herself that tomorrow she would begin the real work, the slow, careful, unglamorous work of rebuilding the accounts from the ground up, dollar by dollar, entry by entry, until the books of Silver Creek Ranch told the true story of the place instead of the false one that had been living inside them for 3 years. It was the kind of work she understood, the kind of work that asked for patience and precision and the willingness to stay with a problem longer than was comfortable. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. She just had not always had a reason to do it somewhere she intended to stay. The first morning after Graves and his deputies rode out with Rusk and Crane, Mara woke before 4 and lay in the dark for a few minutes doing something she rarely allowed herself. Nothing. Not planning. Not organizing. Not running through the list of what needed doing and in what order. Just lying there in the quiet of the ranch house, with the sound of the horses shifting in the paddock outside, and the distant low of cattle somewhere in the north pasture that was still Silver Creek's, that would remain Silver Creek's, that Crestfield Grazing Partners would never develop or sell or subdivide because the forged signature of a dead man was not a legal instrument and never had been. She let that sit for a moment, let it be a real thing rather than just the next item on the list. Then she got up dressed and went to the office. The accounts were waiting. They were always waiting. That was the nature of accounts. They did not resolve themselves, or tidy their own inconsistencies, or decide unilaterally that 3 years of deliberate falsification was enough, and begin telling the truth on their own. They waited for someone to sit down with them and do the patient, unglamorous, necessary work of finding out what was true. Mara sat down. She had been thinking about methodology since the night before, how to structure the reconstruction so that the rebuilt accounts would be not just accurate but defensible, every corrected entry traceable to a source document, nothing resting on her word alone. The legal proceedings ahead would require that. Graves had been clear about it. The formal fraud case against Rusk and Crane would need clean financial documentation that could withstand scrutiny in a territorial court, and the recovered funds from the Bitters Creek account would need to be distributed according to calculations that no opposing lawyer could legitimately challenge. She started with the payroll. It was the right place to start, not just strategically, but because it was the most human part of the damage. The land transfer was significant legally, financially, in terms of what it had nearly cost the Hayes family, but the land was property. The payroll was people. Tom Wyeth's 14 years of reduced wages. Boone Mercer's 60%. The younger men who had arrived at Silver Creek already uncertain of their footing, and been further undermined by a pay scheme designed to make them feel powerless without understanding exactly why. She worked through the morning without stopping. By the time Fran set coffee on the edge of the desk at 7:30, Mara had completed the payroll reconstruction for the full 7 months of Rusk's modified wage schedule, cross-referenced against Hayes Sr.'s contracted rates from the locked desk ledgers. The total shortfall calculated to the dollar was $6,214 across 11 workers. She wrote the number at the bottom of the page, underlined it, and set the page aside. Then she started on the supply accounts. Colter found her there at noon, which was where he had found her every day for the past week, and he set a plate of food on the desk the way Fran had been doing, without comment, without expectation that she would stop working, simply acknowledging that a person needed to eat, even when the work was urgent. She had come to understand this as a form of consideration that suited her better than most forms she had encountered. Practical, undemanding, and consistent. Graves telegraphed, he said, sitting in the chair across the desk. Crane talked. She looked up. When? Day before yesterday, apparently. Graves sent the message yesterday, and it just came through. Colter unfolded the paper he had been carrying. Crane confirmed all 7 properties. Named the investors connected to the scheme 4 men in total, all based in Helena. One of them is a territorial land assessor. Mara set down her pen. A territorial land assessor. She turned that over. That's how the transfers were moving through the registry without being flagged, she said. He had someone's inside the process. Graves is already moving on it. The assessor has been suspended pending investigation. Colter refolded the telegram. The Dunmore account has been frozen. Graves says the combined funds across both accounts amount to roughly $40,000. The number was larger than she had estimated. Not by an enormous margin, but enough to matter. Enough to indicate that the scheme across all 7 properties had been more profitable than even Rusk's disclosure had fully suggested. She thought about the families on those other 6 ranches. Heirs who had trusted the wrong manager. Widows who had needed help and been handed a careful arrangement that was designed to eventually swallow everything they had. How many of the other properties are still in legal jeopardy? She asked. 3 are in active transfer proceedings. Graves has put holds on all of them. Colter paused. The other 3 had already completed transfers. It's going to be more complicated to reverse those, but not impossible. Not impossible, he said. Graves said the death certificate discrepancy model, what you established here, gives the investigators a template. If the same notarization fraud was used at the other properties, and Rusk's statement suggests it was, then the legal basis for challenge is the same. She picked up her pen. I should write out my methodology, she said, half to herself. The cross-referencing process. The specific indicators I use to identify the notarization fraud. If Graves can give the same framework to the investigators at the other properties, they don't need to start from scratch. You could do that in person, Colter said. Graves asked if you'd be willing to consult. She looked at him. From here? From wherever, he said. That was his word, wherever. She looked at the ledger in front of her. I told him I'd think about a formal arrangement. And have you thought about it some? She turned a page. I think I can be more useful at a distance than in a formal role. A formal role comes with institutional constraints. I work better without those, as an independent consultant, as someone who does the work the way it needs to be done. She paused. With appropriate arrangements. In writing. Something crossed his face that was not quite amusement and not quite anything simpler. You negotiate your own contracts, he said. Always have, she said. The one time I didn't, I accepted the assumption that the arrangement was fair, because the man offering it was pleasant. I don't make that mistake anymore. She said this without self-pity and without drama, the way she said most things about the years that had shaped her as fact, as context, as the explanation for why she was the particular kind of person she had become. She had stopped being embarrassed by the origin story a long time ago. A woman who learned her most important lessons from the worst thing that happened to her was not a woman to be pitied. She was a woman who had paid for her education in the hardest currency available and had gotten something real in return. 3 weeks into the reconstruction, the first of the back wages was paid. It came from the Bitters Creek account recovery. Graves had moved quickly on the legal authorization, faster than Mara had expected, and the amount released in the first distribution covered the shortfall for 6 of the 11 workers, with the remainder to follow when the secondary legal steps were completed. Colter had already bridged the gap from operating funds for the interim, as he had said he would. But the arrival of the recovered money meant something different from the bridge payment. It meant the legal process had teeth. It meant what had been taken was being returned by force of law rather than by the charity of the current owner. Boone Mercer received his back wages in cash, counted in Mara's office, with Colter present, and Tom Wyeth standing in the doorway because he had been nearby, and she had not asked him to leave. She put the money on the desk in 2 stacks, the way her father had always counted out money organized, visible, no ambiguity about the amount. Boone looked at the stacks for a moment. He picked them up, held them, and said nothing. Everything that was shorted, Mara said. 7 months and 4 days. 4 days, Boone said. I counted the days, she said. He looked at her with the expression of a man who is trying to locate the appropriate response to something that has moved him more than he expected and is not finding it quickly. Thank you, he said finally. It was inadequate, and he knew it was inadequate, and the knowing was visible, and that made it more than enough. It was yours, Mara said. I just found it. He folded the money and put it in his shirt pocket and walked out of the office, and she heard his footsteps go down the hall and through the kitchen and out the back door. She did not follow, because she understood that some reckonings need to be taken outside, under the open sky, where a person can let the weight of them land without anyone watching. Wyeth, still in the doorway, said, He's going to stand out there for a while. I know, she said. He won't let anyone see it. I know that too. Wyeth nodded slowly. He was a quiet man, not Colter's particular quality of quiet, which was deliberate and aware, but the quietness of a man who had learned that the world moved around him without requiring much comment from him. He had worked this ranch for 14 years and said approximately 6 sentences to Mara in the entire time she had been there, which she respected. Some people communicated clearly by saying very little, and Wyeth was one of them. You're good at this, he said. It came out like something he had been considering whether to say, and had finally decided to say. The accounting? She asked. All of it, he said, and he walked away. The letter to her mother took her 4 attempts. The first 3 were too careful, too organized, too structured, written in the same voice she used for legal documentation, which was the wrong voice for a letter to a woman who had spent the past 5 years watching her daughter leave one place and arrive in another, and never quite stay anywhere long enough to call it home. She tore the 4th attempt in half and started over on a scrap of paper with a shorter pen stroke, and decided that she would simply tell the truth in whatever order it came out. She told her mother that she was in Montana Territory, at a ranch called Silver Creek, and that she had been there for 6 weeks and intended to stay for the foreseeable future. She told her about the work, not the legal intricacies of the fraud case, but the essential shape of it, that someone had been stealing from the ranch and the workers, and that she had found out, and that she had not looked away from it the way she had looked away from nothing in the past 7 years, and that the people who had done the stealing were now in the custody of the territorial authorities. She told her mother that she thought, sometimes, about the kitchen with the low ceiling and the south window that let in the afternoon light at a particular angle in October, about her father's hands, which had been a farmer's hands and then a worker's hands, and then, near the end, an old man's hands, and how the change between those stages had happened faster than it should have. She told her mother that she had not been able to undo what happened to the farm. She had been 21 and too late, and the mechanism of it had already completed by the time she understood it fully. But she wanted her mother to know that she understood it, that she had spent 7 years making sure she understood it well enough that it could not happen to anyone else in her presence without her seeing it and naming it and fighting it, with every piece of documentation she could assemble. She told her mother that there was a man at this ranch, that he was the owner, and that she worked for him in the practical sense, and that neither of those facts were the most important thing about him. She told her mother that he was not easy to know, and that she was not easy to know either, and that this turned out to be something they had in common rather than a problem between them, and that she was still working out what she thought about all of it, but that she wanted her mother to know there was something to work out, because her mother had been asking her, in the careful sideways way mothers ask such things, for several years. She sealed the letter before she could revise it. The formal fraud hearings in Bitters Creek began in the 3rd week of October, 2 months after Graves had ridden out with his deputies and his custody arrangement, and his telegram of confirmed confessions. Mara rode out with Colter and Aldred, who had agreed to appear as a witness and had prepared for it with the thorough seriousness of a man who understood that his credibility was being lent to a proceeding that needed it. The hearing room was a converted general store, long tables, wooden chairs, a judge imported from Helena named Carver who had a reputation for patience and a shorter one for tolerating nonsense. Judge Carver looked at the documentation Mara had prepared with the same thoroughness that Graves and Whitmore had brought to it, and he asked questions that were not about the surface of the evidence, but about its construction, how she had established the notarization timeline, how she had verified the original invoices against the ledger entries, how she had confirmed that the Crestfield entity was not a legitimate operation. His questions told her that he had read everything before the hearing, which was not always the case in proceedings of this kind, and that he had understood what he read, which was less common still, Rusk testified. He had been held in the Bitters Creek jail for 2 months, and looked reduced by it in the way that men of Rusk's particular type are reduced by confinement, the smoothness worn off, the practiced pleasantness replaced by a flat and slightly bewildered affect, as though the person he had constructed over years of deliberate management had been a coat he was now not allowed to wear. He confirmed his written statement. He answered the judge's questions without the half-second delays that had characterized his responses at Silver Creek. He named Crane. He named the Helena investors. He named the territorial land assessor, whose position inside the registry process had made the transfers possible. He did not look at Mara during any of this. Crane's testimony was different. He had obtained his lawyer, a precise man from Helena named Voss, who had clearly advised him to say as little as legally possible, while appearing cooperative, and his answers were careful, bounded, calibrated to give enough to avoid a contempt finding, without giving more than was strategically necessary. He was better at this than Rusk, more controlled. The machinery of his thinking was more refined. But the machinery was operating inside a cage built from Mara's documentation, and the cage was solid, and Voss was good enough at his work to recognize that. The hearing ran 3 days. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Judge Carver issued a preliminary ruling that the North Pasture transfer from Silver Creek Ranch to Crestfield Grazing Partners was void on its face due to fraudulent execution, and that the associated financial instruments, the Bitters Creek account, the Dunmore account, the Helena investment arrangement, were subject to full seizure pending final adjudication. He ordered the immediate release of the recovered funds in the amounts necessary to fulfill the back wage obligations to all Silver Creek workers, and he flagged the remaining 3 active transfer proceedings at the other properties for emergency review, using the framework Mara had submitted with her formal consultation letter to Graves. He also said something that she had not expected at the very end of the day's proceedings before he rose. He said, "The investigation and documentation presented in this case represents a standard of evidentiary preparation that this court does not often see in matters of this complexity, and I would note for the record that the outcome of these proceedings and the protection of the properties and workers affected across this territory is substantially attributable to that preparation." He did not look at anyone specific when he said it. He did not need to. Aldred, sitting beside Mara, said nothing. He simply set his pen down and folded his hands, and she understood from the precision of the gesture that he was pleased. The ride back to Silver Creek was quiet in the good way, the way of people who have been in a loud, difficult place, and are recovering the particular silence of open country, and are not in a hurry to fill it. They stopped at a creek crossing to water the horses, and Colter stood beside his horse watching the water, and said, without preamble, "It's over." "The hearing," she said, "not the investigation." "The investigation will run another year probably." "More," she said, "for the other properties. The reverse transfers alone will take time, but Silver Creek is clear." "Silver Creek is clear," she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. The creek moved past them, indifferent to the human event that had just concluded 40 miles away, and would have consequences for this land for years. "My father would have—" He stopped, started differently. He would have been angry for a long time about Rusk, about the years of it. Right under his nose he looked at the water. He wasn't a man who forgave that kind of thing quickly. He would have wanted to know how it was missed, what he had failed to see, and he would have asked himself those questions harder than anyone else would ask them. "And then," she said, "and then he would have gone back to work," Colter said, "because the ranch needed working, and the cattle needed moving, and the fence needed mending, and a man who stands in the field mourning what was taken from him while the work waits is a man who's going to lose the rest of it." She looked at him. "You sound like him." "I sounded like him more before the argument," he said. "I've been working back toward it." He looked at her briefly. "You've helped with that." "I haven't done anything." "You've been exactly what you are," he said, without apology and without performance. "That's something." He picked up his horse's reins. "My father would have liked you." She considered this. "I might have argued with him about the fence mending schedule. He would have appreciated that," Colter said. "He liked people who knew what they were talking about and said so." She thought then. About her own father, about a man who had not known what he was looking at when it mattered most, who had trusted a pleasant stranger with 20 years of careful building, and paid a price he should never have been asked to pay. She thought about how she had carried that for 7 years as a kind of wound and a kind of fuel simultaneously, the grief and the determination bound together so tightly that she had never been entirely certain which one was driving her on any given day. Standing at this creek, in this territory, with the hearing concluded and the ranch secured, and $6,000 back wages legally released to the men who had earned them, she thought that maybe the distinction had never mattered as much as she had believed. That grief and determination were not as different as she had told herself. That her father, who had been a careful, methodical man, who loved his farm and believed in straight dealing, and was undone by a man with a pleasant face and a constructed answer for every question, would not want to be remembered primarily as the reason she could not stop moving. He would want to be remembered as the man who taught her to keep books properly, which was the thing that had made all of this possible. She picked up her own reins. "Let's go home," she said. The word came out before she had decided to use it, and she heard it in the air and did not take it back. Colter did not make anything of it. He simply turned his horse toward the Silver Creek Road and started moving, and she followed. And the country opened up around them in the broad, unhurried way of Montana country that has been itself since before any particular human trouble, and intends to continue being itself after. November came with a cold snap that frosted the north pasture overnight and sent the cattle instinctively toward the windbreak timber. Mara watched the first frost from the office window at 5 in the morning and felt something she could not immediately name, a quality of settledness, like a thing set on a level surface and released, that she had not felt in a place she was physically present in for a very long time. The accounts were done. Not finished in the sense that accounts are ever finished. Accounts are living things, requiring continuous attention, and she would be maintaining them from here forward with the same care she had brought to the reconstruction, but done in the specific sense she had intended when she started. Fully rebuilt from verified sources, every corrected entry documented, every recovered amount accounted for, the true financial picture of Silver Creek Ranch legible at last after 3 years of deliberate obscuration. She had compiled the reconstruction into a formal report for Graves, which he had received 2 weeks prior, and acknowledged with a telegram that said, characteristically, 2 things only: thorough and useful. She had also submitted her formal consultation agreement to the Territorial Inspector's Office, not the institutional arrangement Graves had first suggested, but an independent consulting arrangement on specific cases at her own schedule and discretion, with written agreements for each engagement. The first engagement beyond Silver Creek had already arrived, in a letter from Graves concerning the Mallory Ranch outside Copperfield, one of the 3 properties in active transfer proceedings. The financial records were a mess. The local bookkeeper had died the previous year, and no one had been maintaining accounts in a coherent form. Graves needed someone who could go through the source documents and reconstruct enough of a financial picture to support the legal challenge. She had written back accepting the engagement and estimating 3 weeks of on-site work, contingent on the availability of original documents. She had not told Colter yet. She told him that evening at the kitchen table after Fran had cleared supper, and the 2 of them were left with coffee and the particular quiet of a house settling into the cold. He took it the way she had anticipated, with a nod, no immediate response, the characteristic pause of a man who thinks before he speaks, and is not going to be hurried out of it. 3 weeks, he said finally. Approximately. Could be less if the source documents are well organized, more if they're not. When? December. Graves needs the report before the January hearing. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, a habit she had noticed. The rotating motion when he was working through something. "You'll come back," he said. Again, not quite a question. "The accounts are here," she said. "My name is on the ledgers. I'm not done with Silver Creek." She paused, "and there are other reasons." He looked at her. "That I haven't entirely sorted out yet," she said. "You said that 2 months ago." "I know. Have you made any progress?" She looked at him across the table, this man she had known for 3 months, who had come back to his father's ranch disguised as a cowboy and worked alongside the men he was trying to protect without demanding credit or position, or even acknowledgement of who he was, who said everything in the fewest words that were actually necessary, and never dressed his feelings up in language that didn't fit them, who had handed her a cup of coffee in Aldred's outer office when she was running on no sleep and said nothing about it, because saying nothing was the appropriate thing. "Some," she said. He nodded once slowly. "I'll take it." "I thought you would," she said. He stood up to take his cup to the basin, and she watched him cross the kitchen, the same basin, the same unhurried step she had first noticed on her second morning at the ranch, when he had been just Colter, and she had been filing him under the category of people she did not yet understand. She had filled in a great deal of that category since then. Not all of it. Some people you went on learning for a long time, and she suspected Colter Hayes was one of those, and she found that she did not mind. The letter from her mother arrived on a Thursday in the second week of November. 2 weeks after Mara's own letter would have reached Missouri. It was 7 pages long, which was 3 pages longer than her mother had ever written to her before, and it covered the ordinary and the extraordinary in equal measure: the neighbor's new horse, the state of the garden before the first freeze, A cousin's wedding in September, her mother's opinion of the cousin's choice of husband. Circumspect. But Mara could read between the lines, and then, in the 5th page, the thing her mother had been building toward. Her mother wrote that she was glad. Not that things had turned out well, not that Mara had succeeded. Her mother was too precise for that kind of generality, but specifically, particularly glad that Mara had found work that fit her. Those were the words, work that fits you. Her mother had watched her leave Missouri at 22 with a battered suitcase and a notebook, and the particular, determined expression she had worn since childhood when she decided she was going to do a thing and was not going to be talked out of. And she had worried in the way that mothers worry, not that her daughter would fail, but that she would succeed at the wrong things for so long that she would forget what the right ones felt like. She wrote that she hoped the man was worthy of her daughter's notice. She wrote this in a single sentence and did not elaborate, which was how her mother handled topics that mattered most to her briefly, clearly, without sentiment that could be misread. Mara read the letter at the office desk and then folded it carefully along its original creases and put it in the bottom drawer of the desk, which was where she kept the things she wanted to be able to find again. She sat for a moment thinking about what her mother had written, work that fits you, and thought that this was the truest thing anyone had said to her in a long time, and that the trueness of it had a complicated texture because the work at Silver Creek fit her in the obvious sense she was good at it, she understood it. It asked exactly the things from her that she had spent years developing the capacity to give, but also in a less obvious sense, which was that it had asked her to be present in a place for longer than was comfortable, to let the place and its people become something she was responsible to, rather than simply employed by, and that this was the part she had been avoiding in all the years of moving, and the part that turned out to matter most. She was 43 days into a conversation with Colter Hayes about what they were to each other that had not yet used any of the words she might have expected that conversation to use, and she thought that this was probably the right pace for two people who had each spent a long time learning not to trust the available vocabulary for such things. The conversation was ongoing. It was made up of coffee cups and early mornings, and the particular silence of two people working in adjacent rooms, and the way he said her name when he was about to tell her something he thought she should know. And she had decided, without formally deciding, that she was willing to see where an ongoing conversation like that ended up. The last week of November, the first real snow came to Silver Creek Ranch. Not a dusting of proper snowfall, 4 inches overnight, the kind that changes the look of a place entirely and reveals it differently in the morning. Every fence post wearing a cap of white, and the pastures turned from brown to a clean, uninterrupted plain of gray-white that the cattle moved across like dark punctuation. Mara was at the north fence line when it stopped snowing. She had ridden out to check the drift conditions near the windbreak, which was a practical task she had added to her regular morning work as autumn deepened, because the accounts of a ranch in winter required an understanding of the winter conditions that affected the numbers, feed consumption, shelter use, the rate at which stock would need supplemental care, and she had decided that a bookkeeper who never left the office was a bookkeeper with incomplete information. This was, she privately acknowledged, only partially a practical reasoning. She had also simply come to like the land. The particular quality of Silver Creek's country, the way the mountains sat to the north in a long, unbroken line, the timber along the ridge holding its shape through every season, the creek itself moving under ice in the cold months with a sound she could hear only if she was very still. She had not expected to like it. She had not expected to like very much about this assignment when she took it. She had expected work, and she had gotten work. And it turned out that underneath the work there was a place that had its own particular character that was unconnected to the fraud she had come to expose, and would remain after the fraud was fully resolved. She heard Colter's horse before she saw him, the sound carrying cleanly in the cold air, and she turned to watch him come across the snow-covered pasture toward her, with the easy seat of a man who has been on horseback since before he had opinions about it. He pulled up beside her and looked at the fence line and the timber beyond it and the strip of sky above the ridge, which was clearing from the east, the gray pulling back to show a winter blue that was so sharp it seemed like a different sky from summer's. "The Copperfield engagement," he said. Graves confirmed the January hearing date. "That means you'll need to leave by the 1st of December. "I know," she said. 2 weeks, give or take." He looked at the ridge. "I've been thinking," he said, "about asking you something. And I've been not asking it, because I wanted to wait until the hearing was finished, and the accounts were settled, and there was no practical urgency attached to the answer." She waited. "I want to court you," he said. "Properly. With your permission and on your terms, whatever those are." He said it the way he said most things, directly, without embellishment, with the particular quality of attention that meant he was saying exactly what he meant, and had considered it before saying it. He was not looking at her when he said it. He was looking at the fence line, the snow along the top rail, the way the timber held the shadow of the morning. Mara looked at the same fence line. She thought about the day she had arrived at Silver Creek, standing at the edge of the road with her suitcase in the dirt, reading the ranch from 200 yards, and knowing already that something was wrong. She thought about the morning she had found Judy Callahan's hidden ledgers, and the cold, specific fear of understanding what she was looking at. She thought about Colter sitting across the parlor table from Rusk with his hands in his lap and saying, in the tone of a man who has made a decision and will not be moved from it, "Don't." She thought about all the mornings at the creek crossing, the letters to Aldred, the hours in the office building a case from the ground up, the ride to Hargrove in the dark. She thought about a woman who had left Missouri at 22 with a battered suitcase and a notebook, and who had been moving since then, not because movement was what she wanted, but because stopping had felt like surrender, and she had not been ready to stop in any of the places she had stopped so far. This place was different. She knew it was different. She had known it for weeks and had been honest with herself about the knowing while declining to act on it prematurely, because premature action was a thing she had trained out of herself in the years since Missouri, and she was not going to abandon that discipline simply because she was feeling something. But the hearing was finished. The accounts were settled. She was leaving for Copperfield in 2 weeks, and coming back to Silver Creek in January, and she had said she was coming back in a voice that had meant it, and Colter Hayes was sitting on his horse in the first snow of winter, asking her to let him be something to her that was different from an employer or an ally, or the man who had handed her coffee in a banker's waiting room. Yes, she said. He looked at her then, on my terms, she said, which include that I keep the accounts and my name stays on the ledgers and nobody decides what my work is worth except me. Agreed, he said, without reservation. And I'm going to Copperfield in December. I know, and there will be other engagements. Other properties. Graves has a long list and I've agreed to work through it. I know that too, he said. I'm not asking you to stop. She looked at him. Then what are you asking? To come with you, he said. Sometimes. When the ranch allows it. Or to be here when you come back. Or both. He paused. I'm not asking you to be something smaller than you are. I'm asking to be in the same direction you're going. She turned that over. It was, she thought, possibly the most precisely right thing anyone had ever said to her on a subject that usually went badly wrong somewhere in the language. That's a reasonable request, she said. I thought so, he said. They sat there for a moment in the snow quiet of the north pasture, the cattle moving somewhere behind them, and the creek somewhere ahead of them under its ice, and the mountains running north in the long unchanging line that had been there before any of this and would be there after. And the feeling Mara had was the one she had sat with in the office that morning before dawn, the settledness of a thing placed on a level surface and released except larger now, and less solitary. She had arrived at Silver Creek Ranch with one battered suitcase and a notebook full of fraudulent numbers and the particular exhausted vigilance of a woman who had been watching for the shape of a particular crime for 7 years. She had found the crime. She had done the work. She had not looked away from it or talked herself out of it, or let the reasonable fear of the situation rewrite her into something smaller and less capable than she was. And she had found something else, underneath the work and around it, and sometimes sitting across from her at a kitchen table in the early morning, that she had not been looking for, because she had stopped looking for things she could not document and verify and enter into a ledger with a source notation. Some things she was learning did not come with source notations. Some things you simply found when you stopped treating the finding as a vulnerability and started treating it as what it was, evidence of a life that was larger than its ledgers. That, she thought, was worth writing down. Not in the accounts were for numbers, and she kept them cleanly and accurately and without sentiment, which was the correct way to keep accounts. But somewhere, in the notebook with the cloth cover that she had carried for 3 years, and replaced the pages in twice, and that had started at Silver Creek, filled with fraudulent figures, and was now filled, page after page, in her small, careful handwriting with the true ones. She had arrived with a notebook full of lies. She was leaving and returning with one full of truth. That was not nothing. That was if she was being accurate about it, which she always tried to be, everything. The snow on the north pasture caught the morning light and held it, and Silver Creek Ranch lay quiet around her. Not the tense quiet of a place suppressing itself, but the genuine quiet of a place that was finally, after a long time, simply at rest. She turned her horse toward home,